father's invisibility cloak at the time, Fudge wasn't to know that. Tom the innkeeper reappeared, wearing an apron over his nightshirt and bearing a tray of tea and crumpets. He placed the tray on the table between Fudge and Harry, and left the parlor, closing the door behind him. "Well, Harry," said Fudge, pouring out tea, "you've had us all in a right flap. I don't mind telling you. Running away from your aunt and uncle's house like that. I've started to think, but you're safe, and that's what matters." Fudge buttered himself a crumpet and pushed the plate towards Harry. "Eat, Harry. You look dead on your feet. Now then, you will be pleased to hear that we
First,
have dealt with the
you must learn to harvest what you need from your surroundings in order to survive. Find some bushes, trees, or even some barrels and strike them to gather useful items.
Miss Dursley has been punctured and her memory has been modified. She has no recollection of the incident at all. So that's that, and no harm done." Fudge smiled at Harry over the rim of his teacup, rather like an uncle surveying a favorite nephew.
You can
Harry
gain
couldn't
knowledge
believe his
simply
ears,
by
opened his
watching.
mouth to speak, couldn't think of anything to say, and closed it again. "Ah, you're worried about the reaction of your aunt and uncle," said Fudge. "Well, I won't deny that they are extremely angry, Harry, but they are prepared to take you back next summer, as long as you stay at Hogwarts for Christmas and Easter holidays." Harry unstuck his throat. "I always stay at Hogwarts for Christmas and Easter holidays," he said, "and I don't ever want to go back to Privet Drive." Now, I'm sure you'll feel differently once you've calmed down," said Fudge in a worried tone. "They are your family, after all, and I'm sure you are fond of each other, very deep down." It didn't occur to Harry to put Fudge right. He was still waiting to hear what was going to happen to him. "So all that remains," said Fudge, now buttering himself a second crumpet, "is to decide where you're going to spend the last 2 weeks of your holidays. I suggest you take a room here at the Leaky Cauldron, and—" "Hang on," blurted Harry. "What about my punishment?" Fudge blinked. "Punishment? I broke the law," Harry said. "The decree for the restriction of underage wizardry." "Oh, my dear boy, we're not going to punish you for a little thing like that," cried Fudge, waving his crumpet impatiently. "It was an accident. We don't send people to Azkaban just for blowing up their aunts." But this didn't tally at all with Harry's past dealings with the Ministry of Magic. "Last year I got an official warning just because a house elf smashed a pudding in my uncle's house," said Harry, frowning. "The Ministry of Magic said I'd be expelled from Hogwarts if there was any more magic there." Unless Harry's eyes were deceiving him, Fudge was suddenly looking awkward. "Circumstances change, Harry. We have to take into account, in the present climate, surely you don't want to be expelled?" "Of course I don't," said Harry. "Well then, what's all the fuss about?" laughed Fudge airily. "Now, have a crumpet, Harry, while I go and see if Tom's got a room for you." Fudge strode out of the parlor, and Harry stared after him. There was something extremely odd going on. Why had Fudge been waiting for him at the Leaky Cauldron, if not to punish him for what he'd done? And now Harry came to think of it, surely it wasn't usual for the Minister of Magic himself to get involved in matters of underage magic. Fudge came back, accompanied by Tom the innkeeper. "Room 11 is free, Harry," said Fudge. "I think you'll be very comfortable. Just one thing, and I'm sure you'll understand. I don't want you wandering into Muggle London, all right? Keep to Diagon Alley, and you're to be back here before dark each night. Sure you'll understand? Tom will be keeping an eye on you for me." "Okay," said Harry slowly. "But why?" "Don't want to lose you again, do we?" said Fudge with a hearty laugh. No. Best we know where you are. Fudge cleared his throat loudly, and picked up his pinstripe cloak. "Well, I'll be off. Plenty to do, you know." "Have you had any luck with Black yet?" Harry asked. Fudge's fingers slipped on the silver fastenings of his cloak. "What's that? Oh, you've heard. Well, no, not yet. But it's only a matter of time. The Azkaban guards have never failed yet, and they are angrier than I've ever seen them." Fudge shuddered slightly. "So I'll say goodbye." He held out his hand, and Harry, shaking it, had a sudden idea. "Minister, can I ask you something?" Certainly, smiled Fudge. Well, third years at Hogwarts are allowed to visit Hogsmeade, but my aunt and uncle didn't sign the permission form. Do you think you could? Fudge was looking uncomfortable. Ah, he said. No, I'm very sorry, Harry. But as I'm not your parent or guardian, but you're the Minister for Magic, said Harry eagerly. If you gave me permission... No, I'm sorry, Harry, but rules are rules, said Fudge flatly. Perhaps you'll be able to visit Hogsmeade next year. In fact, I think it best you don't... Yes, well, I'll be off. Enjoy your stay, Harry. And with a last smile and shake of Harry's hand, Fudge left the room. Tom now moved forward, beaming at Harry. If you follow me, Mr. Potter, he said, I've already taken your things up. Harry followed Tom up a handsome wooden staircase to a door with a brass number 11 on it, which Tom unlocked and opened for him. Inside was a very comfortable-looking bed, some highly polished oak furniture, and a cheerfully crackling fire. And perched on top of the wardrobe, Hedwig! Harry gasped. Snowy Owl clicked her beak and fluttered down onto Harry's arm. Very smart owl you've got there, chuckled Tom. Arrived about 5 minutes after you did. If there's anything you need, Mr. Potter, don't hesitate to ask. He gave another bow and left. Harry sat on his bed for a long time, absent-mindedly stroking Hedwig. The sky outside the window was changing rapidly from deep, velvety blue to cold, steely gray, and then, slowly, to pink, shot with gold. Harry could hardly believe that he'd only left Privet Drive a few hours ago, that he wasn't expelled, and that he was now facing 2 completely Dursley-free weeks. It's been a very weird night, Hedwig, he yawned, and without even removing his glasses, he slumped back onto his pillows and fell asleep. Chapter 4. The Leaky Cauldron. It took Harry several days to get used to his strange new freedom. Never before had he been able to get up whenever he wanted, or eat whatever he fancied. He could even go anywhere he liked, as long as it was in Diagon Alley. And as this long, cobbled street was packed with the most fascinating wizarded shops in the world, Harry felt no desire to break his word to Fudge and stray back into the Muggle world. Harry ate breakfast each morning in the Leaky Cauldron, where he liked watching the other guests. Funny little witches from the country up for a day's shopping. Venerable-looking wizards arguing over the latest article in Transfiguration today. Wild-looking warlocks. Rambunctious dwarves, and once, what looked suspiciously like a hag, who ordered a plate of raw liver from behind a thick woolen balaclava. After breakfast, Harry would go out into the backyard, take out his wand, tap the 3rd brick from the left above the dustbin, and stand back as the archway into Diagon Alley opened in the wall. Harry spent the long, sunny days exploring the shops and eating under the brightly colored umbrellas outside cafes, where his fellow diners were showing each other their purchases. It's a lunarscope, old boy. No more messing around with moonshots, see? Or else discussing the case with Sirius Black.
Personally, I won't let any of my children out until he's back in Azkaban.
Harry didn't have to do his homework under the blankets by torchlight anymore. Now he could sit in the bright sunshine outside Florian Fortescue's ice cream parlor, finishing all his essays with occasional help from Florian Fortescue himself, who, apart from knowing a great deal about medieval witch burnings, gave Harry free Sundays every half hour. Once Harry had refilled his money bag with gold galleons, silver sickles, and bronze knuts from his vault at Gringotts, he needed to exercise a lot of self-control not to spend the whole lot at once. He had to keep reminding himself that he had 5 years to go at Hogwarts, and how it would feel to ask the Dursleys for money for spellbooks, to stop himself buying a handsome set of solid gold gobstones, a wizarding game rather like marbles, in which the stones squirted a nasty-smelling liquid into the other player's face when they lost a point. He was sorely tempted, too, by the perfect, moving model of the galaxy in a large glass ball, which would have meant he never had to take another astronomy lesson. But the thing that tested Harry's resolution most appeared in his favorite shop, Quality Quidditch Supplies, a week after he'd arrived at Leaky Cauldron. Curious to know what the crowd in the shop was staring at, Harry edged his way inside and squeezed in amongst the excited witches and wizards, until he glimpsed a newly erected podium on which was mounted the most magnificent broom he had ever seen in his life.
Just came out. Prototype.
A square-jawed wizard was telling his companion. "It's the fastest broom in the world, isn't it, Dad?" squeaked a boy younger than Harry, who was swinging off his father's arm.
Irish International sides just put in order.
Stable and durable. Foundations are the groundwork for your base. Be sure to craft enough before you begin your base
A
construction.
large witch in front of Harry moved, and he was able to read the sign next to the broom. The Firebolt. This state-of-the-art racing broom sports a streamlined, superfine handle of ash, treated with a diamond-hard polish, and hand-numbered with its own registration number. Each individual selected birch twig in the broom tail has been honed to aerodynamic perfection, giving the Firebolt unsurpassable balance and pinpoint precision. The Firebolt has an acceleration of 0 to 150 miles an hour in 10 seconds, and incorporates an unbreakable braking charm. Price on request. Price on request. Harry didn't like to think how much gold the Firebolt would cost. He'd never wanted anything so much in his whole life. But he had never lost a Quidditch match on his Nimbus 2000. And what was the point of emptying his Gringotts vault for the Firebolt, when he had a very good broom already? Harry didn't ask for the price, but he returned almost every day after that, just to look at the Firebolt. There were, however, things that Harry needed to buy. He went to the apothecary to replenish his store of potions and ingredients, and as his school robes were now several inches too short in the arm and leg, he visited Madame Malkin's robes for all occasions and bought new ones. Most important of all, he had to buy his new school books, which would include those for his 2 new subjects, Care of Magical Creatures and Divination. Harry got a surprise as he looked in at the bookshop window. Instead of the usual display of gold-embossed spellbooks, the size of paving stones, there was a large iron cage behind the glass, which held about 100 copies of the Monster Book of Monsters. Torn pages were flying everywhere as the books grappled with each other, locked together in furious wrestling matches, and snapping aggressively. Harry pulled his book list out of his pocket and consulted it for the first time. The Monster Book of Monsters was listed as the set book for Care of Magical Creatures. Now Harry understood why Hagrid had said it would come in useful. He felt relieved. He'd been wondering whether Hagrid wanted help with some terrifying new pet. As Harry entered Flourish and Blots, the manager came hurrying towards him.
Hogwarts,
He said abruptly.
come to get your new books.
Yes, said Harry. I need...
Get out of the way.
said the manager impatiently, brushing Harry aside. He drew on a pair of very thick gloves, picked up a large, knobbly walking stick, and proceeded towards the door of the monster book's cage. Hang on, said Harry quickly. I've already got one of those.
Have you?
A look of enormous
Never
relief
forget
spread over the
who you
manager's
are.
face.
Thank heavens for that. I've been bitten 5 times already this morning.
A loud ripping noise went through the air. 2 of the monster books had seized a third and were pulling it apart.
Stop it! Stop it!
Cried the manager, poking the walking stick through the bars and knocking the books apart.
I'm never stalking them again. Never.
You can gain knowledge
It's
simply
been
by
bedlam.
watching nature.
I thought we'd seen the worst when we bought 200 copies of the Invisible Book of Invisibility. Cost a fortune, and we never found them. Well, is there anything else I can help you with?
Yes, said Harry.
Never
looking down his
forget
books.
who you are.
I need Unfogging the Future by Cassandra Fablaski.
Starting divination, are you?
Said the manager, stripping off his gloves and leading Harry into the back of the shop, where there was a corner devoted to fortune-telling. A small table was stacked with volumes such as Predicting the Unpredictable, Insulate Yourself Against Shocks, and Broken Balls When Fortunes Turn Foul.
Here you are.
Said the manager, who had climbed a set of steps to take down a thick, black-bound book.
Unfogging the Future. Very good guide to all your basic fortune-telling methods. Palmistry, crystal balls, bird entrails.
But Harry wasn't listening. His eyes had fallen on another book, which was among a display on a small table. Death omens. What to do when you know the worst is coming.
Oh, I wouldn't read that if I were you,
said the assistant lightly, looking to see what Harry was staring at.
You'll start seeing death omens everywhere. It's enough to frighten anyone to death.
But Harry continued to stare at the front cover of the book. It showed a black dog, large as a bear, with gleaming eyes. It looked oddly familiar. The assistant pressed Unfogging the Future into Harry's hands.
You can gain knowledge simply by
He said.
watching.
Yes, said Harry, tearing his eyes away from the dog's, and dazedly consulting his book list. I need Intermediate Transfiguration and the Standard Book of Spells Grade 3. Harry emerged from Flourish and Blots 10 minutes later with his new books under his arms, and made his way back to the Leaky Cauldron, hardly noticing where he was going and bumping into several people. He tramped up the stairs to his room, went inside, and tipped his books onto his bed. Somebody had been in to tidy. The windows were open and the sun was pouring inside. Harry could hear the buses rolling by in the unseen Muggle street behind him, and the sound of the invisible crowd below in Diagon Alley. He caught sight of himself in the mirror over the basin. It can't have been a death omen, he told his reflection defiantly. I was panicking when I saw that thing in Magnolia Crescent. It was probably just a stray dog. He raised his hand automatically and tried to make his hair lie flat.
You're fighting a losing battle there, dear,
said the mirror in a wheezy voice. As the days slipped by, Harry started looking wherever he went for a sign of Ron and Hermione. Plenty of Hogwarts students were arriving in Diagon Alley now, with the start of term so near. Harry met Seamus Finnegan and Dean Thomas, his fellow Gryffindors, in Quality Quidditch Supplies, where they too were ogling the Firebolt. He also ran into the real Neville Longbottom, a round-faced, forgetful boy outside Flourish and Blots. Harry didn't stop to chat. Neville appeared to have mislaid his book list, and was being told off by his very formidable-looking grandmother. Harry hoped she never found out that he'd pretended to be Neville while he was on the run from the Ministry of Magic. Harry woke on the last day of the holidays, thinking that he would at last meet Ron and Hermione tomorrow on the Hogwarts Express. He got up, dressed, went for a last look at the Firebolt, and was just wondering where he'd have lunch, when someone yelled his name and he turned. Harry! Harry! They were there, both of them, sitting outside Florian Fortescue's ice cream parlor. Ron looking incredibly freckled, Hermione very brown, both waving frantically at him.
Finally,
said Ron, grinning at Harry as he sat down.
We went to the Leaky Cauldron, but they said you'd left. And we went to Flourish and Blots and Madame Malkin's, and
I got all my school stuff last week, Harry explained. And how come you know I'm staying at the Leaky Cauldron?
Dad,
said Ron simply. Mr. Weasley, who worked at the Ministry of Magic, would of course have heard the whole story of what had happened to Aunt Marge.
Did you really blow up your aunt, Harry?
Said Hermione in a very serious voice. I didn't mean to, said Harry while Ron roared with laughter. I just lost control.
It's not funny, Ron,
said Hermione sharply.
Honestly, I'm amazed Harry wasn't expelled.
So am I, admitted Harry. Forget expelled. I thought I was going to be arrested. He looked at Ron. Your dad doesn't know why Fudge let me off, does he?
Probably because it's you, isn't it?
Shrugged Ron, still chuckling.
Famous Harry Potter and all that? I'd hate to see what the Ministry'd do to me if I blew up my aunt. Mind you, they'd have to dig me up first, because Mum would have killed me. Anyway, you can ask Dad yourself this evening. We're staying at the Leaky Cauldron tonight, too. So you can come to King's Cross with us tomorrow. Hermione's there as well.
Hermione nodded, beaming.
Mom and Dad dropped me off this morning with all my Hogwarts things.
Excellent, said Harry happily. So have you got all your new books and stuff?
Look at this,
said Ron, pulling a long, thin box out of a bag and opening it.
Brand new wand, 14 inches, willow, containing 1 unicorn tail. And we've got all our books.
He pointed at a large bag under his chair.
What about those monster books, eh? The assistant nearly cried when we said we wanted 2.
What's all that, Hermione? Harry asked, pointing at not 1, but 3 bulging bags in the chair next to her.
Well, I'm taking more new subjects than you, aren't I?
Said Hermione.
Those are my books for arithmetic, care of magical creatures, divination, ancient runes, muggle studies.
What are you doing Muggle studies for?
Said Ron, rolling his eyes at Harry.
You're Muggle-born. Your mom and dad are Muggles. You already know all about Muggles.
But it's fascinating to study them from the wizarding point of view,
said Hermione earnestly. Are you planning to eat or sleep at all this year, Hermione? Asked Harry, while Ron sniggered. Hermione ignored them.
I've still got 10 galleons,
she said, checking her purse.
It's my birthday in September, and Mum and Dad gave me some money to get myself an early birthday present.
How about a nice book?
Losing one's way could be worse.
No, I don't think so,
said Hermione composedly.
I really want an owl. I mean, Harry's got Hedwig, and you've got Errol.
I haven't,
said Ron.
Errol's a family owl. All I've got is Scabbers.
He pulled his pet rat out of his pocket.
And I want to get him checked over,
he added, placing Scabbers on the table in front of him.
I don't think Egypt agreed with him.
Scabbers was looking rather thinner than usual, and there was a definite droop to his whiskers. There's a magical creature shop just over there, said Harry, who knew Diagon Alley very well by now. You can see if they've got anything for Scabbers, and Hermione can get her owl. So they paid for their ice creams and crossed the street to the magical menagerie. There wasn't much room inside. Every inch of wall was hidden by cages. It was smelly and very noisy, because the occupants of these cages were all squeaking, squawking, jabbering, or hissing. The witch behind the counter was already advising a wizard on the care of double-ended newts. So Harry, Ron, and Hermione waited, examining the cages. A pair of enormous purple toads sat, gulping wetly, and feasting on dead blowflies. A gigantic tortoise with a jewel-encrusted shell was glittering near the window. Poisonous orange snails were oozing slowly up the side of their glass tank. And a fat white rabbit kept changing into a silk top hat, and back again with a loud popping noise. Then there were cats of every color, a noisy cage of ravens, a basket of funny custard-colored furballs that were humming loudly, and on the counter, a vast cage of sleek black rats, which were playing some sort of skipping game using their long, bald tails. The double-ended newt wizard left, and Ron approached the counter.
It's my rat,
People will
he told the
die.
witch.
It's been a bit off-color ever since I brought him back from Egypt.
Bang him on the counter, said the witch, pulling a pair of heavy black spectacles out of her pocket. Ron lifted Scabbers out of his inside pocket and placed him next to the cage of his fellow rats, who stopped their skipping tricks and scuffled to the wire for a better look. Like nearly everything Ron owned,
Losing
Scabbers
one's
the rat
way
was secondhand.
could be
He'd once belonged to Ron's older brother, Percy, and a bit battered. Next to the glossy rats in the cage, he looked especially woebegone. Said the witch, picking up Scabbers. How old is the rat?
Dunno.
You can gain knowledge simply by
Quite old. He used to
watching
belong to my
nature.
brother.
What powers does he have? Said the witch, examining Scabbers closely. Said Ron. The truth was that Scabbers had never shown the faintest trace of interesting powers. The witch's eyes moved from Scabbers' tattered left ear to his front paw, which had a toe missing, and tutted loudly. He's been through the mill, this one, she said.
He was like that when Percy gave him to me.
Said Ron defensively. An ordinary common or garden rat like this can't be expected
Losing
to live
one's
longer than
way
3
could be
years or
worse
so,
than death.
said the witch. Now, if you were looking for something a bit more hard-wearing, you might like one of these. She indicated the black rats, who promptly started skipping again. Ron muttered,
Show-offs.
Well, if you don't want a replacement, you can try this rat tonic, said the witch, reaching under the counter and bringing out a small red bottle.
Okay.
Said Ron.
How much?
Ouch! Ron buckled as something huge and orange came soaring from the top of the highest cage, landed on his head, and then propelled itself.
What can I do for you?
Scabbers. No, Crookshanks, no! Cried the witch, but Scabbers shot from between her hands like a bar of soap, landed splay-legged on the floor, and then scampered for the door.
Scabbers!
Ron shouted. Harry ran out of the shop after him. Harry followed. It took them nearly 10 minutes to find Scabbers, who'd taken refuge under a waste paper bin outside Quality Quidditch Supplies. Ron stuffed the trembling rat back into his pocket and straightened up, massaging his head.
What was that?
It was either a very big cat or quite a small tiger, said Harry.
Where's Hermione?
Probably getting her
Never
home.
forget who you are.
They made their way back up the crowded street to the magical menagerie. As they reached it, Hermione came out. But she wasn't carrying an owl. Her arms were clapped tightly around the enormous ginger cat.
You bought that monster?
Said Ron, his mouth hanging open.
He's gorgeous, isn't he?
Said Hermione, glowing. That was a matter of opinion, thought Harry. The cat's ginger fur was thick and fluffy, but it was definitely a bit bow-legged, and its face looked grumpy and oddly squashed, as though it had run headlong into a brick wall. Now that Scabbers was out of sight, however, the cat was purring contentedly in Hermione's arms.
Hermione, the thing nearly scalped me,
said Ron.
He didn't mean
Losing
to.
one's way could be worse than
Said
death.
Hermione.
What about Scabbers?
Said Ron, pointing at the lump in his chest pocket.
He needs rest and relaxation. How's he gonna get it with that thing around?
That reminds me. I forgot your rat tonic.
Said Hermione, slapping the small red bottle into Ron's hand.
And stop worrying.
People will.
Crookshanks will be sleeping in my dormitory, and Scabbers in yours. What's the problem? Poor Crookshanks. That witch said he'd been in there for ages. No one wanted him.
I wonder why.
Said Ron sarcastically.
Never forget
as
who
they
you
set off
are.
towards the Leaky Cauldron. They found Mr. Weasley sitting at the bar, reading the Daily Prophet.
Harry,
He said, smiling as he looked up.
how are you?
Never forget.
Fine, thanks, said Harry, as he, Ron, and Hermione joined Mr. Weasley with all their shopping. Mr. Weasley put down his paper, and Harry saw the now familiar picture of Sirius Black staring up at him. You still haven't caught him, then? He asked.
No,
Said Mr. Weasley, looking extremely grave.
they've pulled us all off our regular jobs at the Ministry to try and find him. But no luck so far.
People
Never
will
forget.
die.
Will we get a
You
reward
are.
if we caught him?
Asked Ron.
It'd be good to get some more money. Don't be ridiculous, Ron.
Said Mr. Weasley. On closer inspection looked very strained.
Black's not going to be caught by a 13-year-old wizard. It's the Azkaban guards who will get him back. You mark my words.
At that moment, Mrs. Weasley entered the bar, laden with shopping, followed by the twins, Fred and George, who were about to start their 5th year at Hogwarts. The newly elected head boy, Percy, and the Weasleys' youngest child, and only girl, Ginny. Ginny, who had always been very taken by Harry, seemed even more heartily embarrassed than usual when she saw him, perhaps because he had saved her life during their last term at Hogwarts. She went very red and muttered, "Hello," without looking at him. Percy, however, held out his hand solemnly, as though he and Harry had never met, and said, "Harry, how nice to see you." "Hello, Percy," said Harry, trying not to laugh. "I hope you're well," said Percy pompously, shaking hands. It was rather like being introduced to the mayor. "Very well, thanks."
Harry!
Said Fred, elbowing Percy out of the way and bowing deeply.
Simply splendid to see you, old boy. Marvelous!
Said George, pushing Fred aside and seizing Harry's hand in turn.
Absolutely spiffing.
Percy scowled.
People will die.
"That's enough now," said Mrs. Weasley.
Mom,
Said Fred, as though he'd only just spotted her, and seized her hand too.
how really corking to see you.
"I said that's enough," said Mrs. Weasley, depositing her shopping in an empty chair. "Hello, Harry dear. I suppose you've heard our exciting news?" She pointed at the brand new silver badge on Percy's chest.
You can gain knowledge simply by
Second head boy
watching
in the
nature.
family, she said, swelling with pride.
And last,
Fred muttered under his breath. "I don't doubt that," said Mrs. Weasley, frowning suddenly. "I notice they haven't made you two prefects."
what do we want to be prefects for?
Said George, looking revolted at the very idea.
To take all the fun out of life.
Ginny giggled. "You want to set a better example to your sister," snapped Mrs. Weasley. "Ginny's got
People
other
will
brothers
die.
to set her an example, Mother," said Percy loftily. "I'm going up to change for dinner." He disappeared and George heaved a sigh.
We tried to shut him in a pyramid.
He told Harry.
but Mom spotted us.
Tom the innkeeper put 3 tables together in the parlor, and the 7 Weasleys, Harry, and Hermione ate their way through 5 delicious courses.
How are we getting to King's Cross tomorrow, Dad?
Asked Fred, as they tucked into a sumptuous chocolate pudding.
The Ministry's providing a couple of cars,
said Mr. Weasley. Everyone looked up at him. Why? Said Percy curiously.
It's because of you, Perce,
said George seriously.
And there'll be little flags on the bonnets, with HB on them. For humongous big head,
said Fred. Everyone except Percy and Mrs. Weasley snorted into their pudding. Why are the Ministry providing cars, Father? Percy asked again in a dignified voice.
Well, as we haven't got one anymore,
said Mr. Weasley.
And as I work there, they're doing me a favor.
His voice was casual, but Harry couldn't help noticing that Mr. Weasley's ears had gone red, just like Ron's did, when he was under pressure.
Good job, too,
said Mrs. Weasley briskly. Do you realize how much luggage you've all got between you? A nice sight you'd be on the Muggle Underground. We're all packed, aren't you? Ron hasn't put all his new things in his trunk yet, said Percy, in a long-suffering voice. He's dumped them on my bed. You'd better go and pack properly, Ron, because we won't have much time in the morning, Mrs. Weasley called down the table. Ron scowled at Percy. After dinner, everyone felt very full and sleepy. One by one, they made their way upstairs to their rooms, to check their things for the next day. Ron and Percy were next door to Harry. He had just closed and locked his own trunk when he heard angry voices through the wall, and went to see what was going on. The door of number 12 was ajar, and Percy was shouting. It was here! On the bedside table. I took it off for polishing.
I haven't touched it, all right?
Ron roared back. What's up? Said Harry. My head boy badge has gone, said Percy, rounding on Harry.
So's Scabbers' rat tonic,
said Ron, throwing things out of his trunk to look.
I think I might have left it in the bar.
You're not going anywhere till you found my badge, yelled Percy. I'll get Scabbers' stuff. I'm packed, Harry said to Ron, and he went downstairs. Harry was halfway along the passage to the bar, which was now very dark, when he heard another pair of angry voices coming from the parlor. A second later, he recognized them as Mr. and Mrs. Weasley's. He hesitated, not wanting them to know he'd heard them rowing, when the sound of his own name made him stop, then move closer to the parlor door.
Makes no sense not to tell him,
Mr. Weasley was saying heartedly.
Never forget who
Harry's
you are.
got a right to know. I've tried to tell Fudge, but he insists on treating Harry like a child. He's 13 years old, and
Arthur, the truth would terrify him, said Mrs. Weasley shrilly. Do you really want to send Harry back to school without hanging over him? For heaven's sake, he's happy not knowing.
Losing one's
I don't want
way
to make him
could be
miserable.
worse
I
than
want to
death.
put him on his guard.
Retorted Mr. Weasley.
You know what Harry and Ron are like, wandering off by themselves. They've ended up in the Forbidden Forest twice. But Harry mustn't do that this year. When I think what could have happened to him that night he ran away from home, if the night bus hadn't picked him up, I'm prepared to bet he would have been dead before the Ministry had found him.
But he's not dead. He's fine, so what's the point?
Molly, they say Sirius Black's mad, and maybe he is. But he was clever enough to escape from Azkaban, and that's supposed to be impossible. It's been 3, and no one's seen hide nor hair of him. And I don't care what Fudge keeps telling the Daily Prophet. We're no nearer catching Black than inventing self-spelling wands. The only thing we know for sure...
Each foundation and wall you lay counts towards building your stronghold. Even a base built from the simplest materials could help to keep you safe from the wilderness.
He could break into Hogwarts.
But no one's really sure that Black's after Harry. There was a thud of wood, and Harry was sure Mr. Weasley had banged his fist on the table.
Molly, how many times do I have to tell you? They didn't report it in the press, because Fudge wanted to keep it quiet. But Fudge went out to Azkaban the night Black escaped. The guards told Fudge that Black's been talking in his sleep for a while now. Always the same words. He's at Hogwarts. He's at Hogwarts. Black is deranged, Molly. and he wants Harry dead. If you ask me, he thinks murdering Harry will bring you-know-who back to power. Black lost everything the night Harry stopped you-know-who, and he's had 12 years alone in Azkaban to brood on that.
There was a silence. Harry leaned still closer to the door, desperate to hear more.
Well, Arthur, you must do what you think is right, but you're forgetting Albus Dumbledore. I don't think anything could hurt Harry at Hogwarts while Dumbledore's headmaster. I suppose he knows about all this? Of course he knows. We had to ask him if he minds the Azkaban guards stationing themselves around the entrances to the school grounds. He wasn't happy about it, but he agreed. Not happy? Why shouldn't he be happy? If they're there to catch Black? Dumbledore isn't fond of the Azkaban guards, said Mr. Weasley heavily. Nor am I, if it comes to that. But when you're dealing with a wizard like Black, you sometimes have to join forces with those you'd rather avoid. If they save Harry, then I will never say another word against them, said Mr. Weasley wearily. It's late, Molly. We better go up.
Harry heard chairs move. As quietly as he could, he hurried down the passage to the bar and out of sight. The parlor door opened, and a few seconds later, footsteps told him that Mr. and Mrs. Weasley were climbing the stairs. The bottle of rat tonic was lying under the table they had sat at earlier. Harry waited until he heard Mr. and Mrs. Weasley's bedroom door close, then headed back upstairs with the bottle. Fred and George were crouching in the shadows on the landing, heaving with laughter as they listened to Percy, dismantling his and Ron's room in search of his badge.
We've got it,
Fred whispered to Harry.
We've been improving it.
The badge now read, Big Head Boy. Harry, forced to laugh, went to give Ron the rat tonic, then shut himself in his room and lay down on his bed. So Sirius Black was after him. That explained everything. Fudge had been lenient with him because he was so relieved to find him alive. He made Harry promise to stay in Diagon Alley, where there were plenty of wizards to keep an eye on him. And he was sending 2 ministry cars to take them all to the station tomorrow, so that the Weasleys could look after Harry until he was on the train. Harry lay listening to the muffled shouting next door, and wondering why he didn't feel more scared. Sirius Black had murdered 13 people with one curse. Mr. and Mrs. Weasley obviously thought Harry would be panic-stricken if he knew the truth. But Harry happened to agree wholeheartedly with Mrs. Weasley that the safest place on Earth was wherever Albus Dumbledore happened to be. Didn't people always say that Dumbledore was the only person Lord Voldemort had ever been afraid of? Surely Black, as Voldemort's right-hand man, would be just as frightened of him. And then there was the Azkaban guards everyone kept talking about. They seemed to scare most people senseless. And if they were stationed all around the school, Black's chances of getting inside seemed very remote. No, all in all, the thing that bothered Harry most was the fact that his chances of visiting Hogsmeade now looked like 0. Nobody would want Harry to leave the safety of the castle until Black was caught. In fact, Harry suspected his every move would be carefully watched until the danger had passed. He scowled at the dark ceiling. Did they think he couldn't look after himself? He'd escaped Lord Voldemort 3 times. He wasn't completely useless. Unbidened, the image of the beast in the shadows of Magnolia Crescent crossed his mind. What to do when you know the worst is coming? I'm not going to be murdered, Harry said out loud. That's the spirit, dear, said the mirror sleepily. Chapter 5. The Dementor. Tom woke Harry next morning with his usual toothless grin and a cup of tea. Harry got dressed and was just persuading disgruntled Hedwig to get back into her cage when Ron banged his way into the room, pulling a sweatshirt over his head and looking irritable.
The sooner we get on the train, the better, he said. At least I can get away from Percy at Hogwarts. Now he's accusing me of dripping tea on his photo of Penelope Clearwater. You know, Ron grimaced, his girlfriend. She's hidden her face under the frame because her nose has gone all blotchy.
I've got something to tell you, Harry began, but they were interrupted by Fred and George, who had looked in to congratulate Ron on infuriating Percy again. They headed down to breakfast, where Mr. Weasley was reading the front page of the Daily Prophet with a furrowed brow, and Mrs. Weasley was telling Hermione and Ginny about a love potion she'd made as a young girl. All 3 of them were rather giggly.
What were you saying?
Ron asked Harry as they sat down.
Later, Harry muttered, as Percy stormed in. Harry had no chance to speak to Ron or Hermione in the chaos of leaving. They were too busy heaving all their trunks down the Leaky Cauldron's narrow staircase, and piling them up near the door, with Hedwig and Hermes, Percy's Screech Owl, perched on top in their cages.
Never forget
A small
who you
wicker
are.
basket stood beside the heap of trunks, spitting loudly.
It's all right, Crookshanks.
Hermione cooed through the wickerwork.
I'll let you out on the train.
You won't, Ron snapped. What about poor Scabbers, eh? He pointed at his chest, where a large lump indicated that Scabbers was curled up in his pocket. Mr. Weasley, who had been outside waiting for the
You can
ministry
gain
cars,
knowledge
stuck his head
simply
inside.
by watching nature.
They're here, he said. Harry, come on. Mr. Weasley marched Harry across the short stretch of pavement towards the first of the two old-fashioned dark green cars, each of which was driven by a furtive-looking wizard, wearing a suit of emerald velvet. In you get, Harry, said Mr. Weasley, glancing up and down the crowded street. Harry got into the back of the car, and was shortly joined by Hermione, Ron, and to Ron's disgust, Percy. The journey to King's Cross was very uneventful, compared to Harry's trip on the night bus. The Ministry of Magic cars seemed almost ordinary, though Harry noticed that they could slide through gaps that Uncle Vernon's new company car certainly couldn't have managed. They reached King's Cross with 20 minutes to spare. The Ministry drivers found their trolleys, unloaded their trunks, touched their hats to Mr. Weasley, and drove away, somehow managing to jump an unmoving queue for the traffic lights. Mr. Weasley kept close to Harry's elbow all the way into the station. Right then, he said, glancing around them. Let's do this in pairs, as there are so many of us. I'll go through first with Harry. Mr. Weasley strolled towards the barrier between platforms 9 and 10, and apparently very interested in Intercity 125 that had just arrived at platform 9. With a meaningful look at Harry, he leaned casually against the barrier. Harry imitated him. Next moment, they had fallen sideways through the solid metal onto platform 9 3/4, and looked up to see the Hogwarts Express, a scarlet steam engine, puffing smoke over a platform packed with witches and wizards, seeing their children onto the train. Percy and Ginny suddenly appeared behind Harry. They were panting and had apparently taken the barrier at a run. "Ah, there's Penelope," said Percy, smoothing his hair and going pink again. Ginny caught Harry's eye, and they both turned away to hide their laughter as Percy strode over to a girl with long curly hair, walking with his chest thrown out so that she couldn't miss his shiny badge. Once the remaining Weasleys and Hermione had joined them, Harry and Mr. Weasley led the way to the end of the train, past packed compartments, to a carriage that looked quite empty. They loaded the trunks onto it, stowed Hedwig and Crookshanks in the luggage rack, then went back outside to say goodbye to Mr. and Mrs. Weasley. Mrs. Weasley kissed all her children, then Hermione, and finally Harry. He was embarrassed, but really quite pleased, when she gave him an extra hug. "Do take care, won't you, Harry?" she said as she straightened up, her eyes oddly bright. Then she opened her enormous handbag and said, "I've made you all sandwiches. Here you are, Ron. No, they're not corned beef. Fred, where's Fred? Here you are, dear." "Harry," said Mr. Weasley quietly, "come over here a moment." He jerked his head towards the pillar, and Harry followed him behind it, leaving the others crowded around Mrs. Weasley. "There's something I've got to tell you before you leave," said Mr. Weasley in a tense voice. "It's all right, Mr. Weasley," said Harry. "I already know." "You know? How could you know?" I heard you and Mrs. Weasley talking last night. I couldn't help hearing," Harry added quickly. "Sorry. That's not the way I'd have chosen for you to find out," said Mr. Weasley, looking anxious. "No, honestly, it's okay. This way you haven't broken your word to Fudge, and I know what's going on." "Harry, you must be very scared." "I'm not," said Harry sincerely. "Really?" he added, because Mr. Weasley was looking disbelieving. "I'm not trying to be a hero, but seriously, Sirius Black can't be worse than Voldemort, can he?" Mr. Weasley flinched at the sound of the name, but overlooked it. "Harry, I knew you were, well, made of stronger stuff than Fudge seems to think. And obviously I'm pleased that you're not scared, but—" "Arthur!" called Mrs. Weasley, who was now shepherding the rest onto the train. "Arthur, what are you doing? It's about to go!" "He's coming, Molly," said Mr. Weasley, but he turned back to Harry and kept talking in a lower and more hurried voice. "Listen, I want you to give me your word that I'll be a good boy and stay in the castle," said Harry gloomily. "Not entirely," said Mr. Weasley,
He looked more serious than Harry had ever seen him.
Swear to me that you won't go looking for Black.
Harry stared. What? There was a loud whistle. Guards were walking along the train, slamming all the doors shut.
Promise me, Harry,
said Mr. Weasley, talking more quickly still,
that whatever happens...
Why would I go looking for someone I know wants to kill me? Said Harry blankly.
Swear to me that whatever you might hear...
Arthur, quickly! Cried Mrs. Weasley. Steam was billowing from the train. It had started to move. Harry ran to the compartment door, and Ron threw it open, and stood back to let him on. They leaned out of the window and waved at Mr. and Mrs. Weasley, until the train turned a corner and blocked them from view. I need to talk to you in private, Harry muttered to Ron and Hermione as the train picked up speed.
Go away, Ginny,
said Ron. Oh, that's nice, said Ginny huffily, and she stalked off. Harry, Ron, and Hermione set off down the corridor, looking for an empty compartment. But all were full except for the one at the very end of the train. This only had one occupant, a man sitting fast asleep next to the window. Harry, Ron, and Hermione checked on the threshold. The Hogwarts Express was usually reserved for students, and they'd never seen an adult there before, except for the witch who pushed the food trolley. The stranger was wearing an extremely shabby set of wizard's robes, which had been darned in several places. He looked ill and exhausted. Though quite young, his light brown hair was flecked with grey.
Who do you reckon he is?
Ron hissed, as they sat down and slid the door shut, taking the seats furthest away from the window.
Professor R.J. Lupin,
whispered Hermione at once.
How do you know that?
It's on his case,
replied Hermione, pointing at the luggage rack over the man's head, where there was a small, battered case held together with a large quantity of neatly knotted string. The name Professor R.J. Lupin was stamped across one corner in peeling letters.
Wonder what he teaches,
said Ron, frowning at Professor Lupin's pallid profile.
That's obvious,
whispered Hermione.
There's only one vacancy, isn't there? Defense against the dark arts.
Harry, Ron, and Hermione had already had 2 Defense Against the Dark Arts teachers, both of whom had only lasted 1 year. There were rumors that the job was jinxed.
Well, I hope he's up to it,
said Ron doubtfully.
He looks like one good hex would finish him off, doesn't he? Anyway.
He turned to Harry.
What were you going to tell us?
Harry explained all about Mr. and Mrs. Weasley's argument, and the warning Mr. Weasley had just given him. When he'd finished, Ron looked thunderstruck, but Hermione had her hands over her mouth. She finally lowered them to say,
Sirius Black escaped to come after you? Oh, Harry, you'll have to be really, really careful. Don't go looking for trouble, Harry.
I don't go looking for trouble, said Harry, nettled. Trouble usually finds me.
How thick would Harry have to be to go looking for a nutter who wants to kill him?
Said Ron shakily. They were taking the news worse than Harry had expected. Both Ron and Hermione seemed to be much more frightened of Black than he was.
No one knows how he got out of Azkaban,
said Ron uncomfortably.
No one's ever done it before. And he was a top security prisoner, too.
But they'll catch him, won't they?
Said Hermione earnestly.
I mean, they've got all the muggles looking out for him, too.
What's that noise?
Said Ron suddenly. A faint, tiny sort of whistle was coming from somewhere. They looked all around the compartment.
Coming from your trunk, Harry,
said Ron, standing up and reaching into the luggage rack. A moment later, he had pulled the pocket sneakoscope out from between Harry's robes. It was spinning very fast in the palm of Ron's hand and glowing brightly.
Is that a sneakoscope?
Said Hermione interestedly, standing up for a better look.
Yeah, mind you, it's a very cheap one,
Ron said.
It went haywire just as I was tying it to Errol's leg to send it to Harry.
Were you doing anything untrustworthy at the time?
Said Hermione shrewdly.
No. Well, I wasn't supposed to be using Errol. You know, he's not really up to long journeys. But how else was I supposed to get Harry's present to him?
Stick it back in the trunk, Harry advised, as the sneakoscope whistled piercingly. Or it'll wake him up. He nodded towards Professor Lupin. Ron stuffed the sneakoscope into a particularly horrible pair of Uncle Vernon's old socks, which deadened the sound, then closed the lid of the trunk on it.
We could get it checked in at Hogsmeade,
said Ron, sitting back down.
They sell that sort of thing in Dervish and Bangs. Magical instruments and stuff. Fred and George told me.
Do you know much about Hogsmeade?
Asked Hermione keenly.
I read it's the only entirely non-magical settlement in Britain.
Yeah, I think it is,
said Ron in an offhand sort of way.
But that's not why I want to go. I just want to get inside Honeydukes.
What's that?
Said Hermione. It's this sweet shop, said Ron, a dreamy look coming over his face. Where they've got everything. Pepper imps, they make you smoke at the mouth. Great fat chocoballs, full of strawberry mousse and clotted cream, and really excellent sugar quills, which you can suck in class, and just look like you're thinking what to write next.
But Hogsmeade's a very interesting place, isn't it?
Hermione pressed on eagerly.
In Sites of Historical Sorcery, it says the inn was the headquarters for the 1612 Goblin Rebellion, and the Shrieking Shack's supposed to be the most severely haunted building in Britain.
And massive sherbet balls that make you levitate a few inches off the ground while you're sucking on them, said Ron, who was plainly not listening to a word Hermione was saying. Hermione looked around at Harry.
Won't it be nice to get out of the school for a bit and explore Hogsmeade?
Suspect it will, said Harry heavily. You'll have to tell me when you found out. What do you mean? Said Ron. I can't go. The Dursleys didn't sign my permission form, and Fudge wouldn't either. Ron looked horrified. You're not allowed to come? But, no way! McGonagall or someone will give you permission. Harry gave a hollow laugh. Professor McGonagall, head of Gryffindor House, was very strict. Or we can ask Fred and George. They know every secret passage out of the castle.
Ron!
Said Hermione sharply.
I don't think Harry should be sneaking out of school with Black on the loose.
Yeah, I expect that's what McGonagall will say when I asked for permission, said Harry bitterly. But if we're with him, said Ron spiritedly to Hermione, Black wouldn't dare.
Oh, Ron, don't talk rubbish,
snapped Hermione.
Black's already murdered a whole bunch of people in the middle of a crowded street. Do you really think he's going to worry about attacking Harry just because we're there? She was fumbling with the straps of Crookshank's basket as she spoke. Don't let that thing out, Ron said, but too late. Crookshank leapt lightly from the basket, stretched, yawned, and sprang onto Ron's knees. The lump in Ron's pocket trembled, and he shoved Crookshanks angrily away. Get out of it! Ron, don't!
Said Hermione angrily. Ron was about to answer back when Professor Lupin stirred. They watched him apprehensively, but he simply turned his head the other way, mouth slightly open, and slept on. The Hogwarts Express moved steadily north, and the scenery outside the window became
People will
wilder and
die.
darker, while the clouds overhead thickened. People were chasing backwards and forwards, past the door of their compartment. Crookshanks had now settled in an empty seat, his squashed face turned towards Ron, his yellow eyes on Ron's top pocket. At 1 o'clock, the plump witch with the food trolley arrived at the compartment door. Do you think we should wake him up? Ron asked awkwardly, nodding towards Professor Lupin. He looks like he could do with some food. Hermione approached Professor Lupin cautiously.
Never forget who you are.
Professor,
she said.
Excuse me, Professor.
He didn't move. Don't worry, dear, said the witch, as she handed Harry a large stack of cauldron cakes. If he's hungry when he wakes up, I'll be up front with the driver. I suppose he is asleep, said Ron quietly, as the witch slid the compartment door closed.
People will die.
He hasn't died, has he?
No, he's still breathing,
whispered Hermione, taking the cauldron cake Harry passed her. He might not be very good company, but Professor Lupin's presence in their compartment had its uses. Mid-afternoon, just as it had started to rain, blurring the rolling hills outside the window, they heard footsteps in the corridor again, and their three least favorite people appeared at the door. Draco Malfoy, flanked by his cronies, Vincent Crabbe and Gregory Goyle. Draco Malfoy and Harry had been enemies ever since they had met on their very first train journey to Hogwarts. Malfoy, who had a pale, pointed, sneering face, was in Slytherin House. He played Seeker on the Slytherin Quidditch team, the same position that Harry played on the Gryffindor team. Crabbe and Goyle seemed to exist to do Malfoy's bidding. They were both wide and muscly. Crabbe was the taller, with a pudding basin haircut and a very thick neck. Goyle had short, bristly hair and long gorilla arms.
Well, look who it is,
said Malfoy in his usual lazy drawl, pulling open the compartment door.
Potty and the Weasel.
Crabbe and Goyle chuckled trollishly.
I heard your father finally got his hands on some gold this summer, Weasley,
said Malfoy.
Did your mother die of shock?
Ron stood up so quickly he knocked Crookshank's basket to the floor.
Professor Lupin gave a snort.
Who's that?
Said Malfoy, taking an automatic step backwards as he spotted Lupin. New teacher, said Harry, who had got to his feet too, in case he needed to hold Ron back.
What were you saying, Malfoy?
Malfoy's pale eyes narrowed. He wasn't fool enough to pick a fight right under a teacher's nose.
Come on,
he muttered resentfully to Crabbe and Goyle, and they disappeared. Harry and Ron sat down again. Ron was soldering his knuckles. I'm not going to take any rubbish from Malfoy this year, he said angrily. I mean it. If he makes one more crack about my family, I'm going to get hold of his head and... Ron made a violent gesture in midair. Ron! Hissed Hermione, pointing at Professor Lupin. Be careful! But Professor Lupin was still fast asleep. The rain thickened as the train sped yet further north. The windows were now a solid shimmery grey, which gradually darkened until lanterns flickered into life all along the corridors and over the luggage racks. The train rattled. The rain hammered. The wind roared. But still, Professor Lupin slept. We must be nearly there, said Ron, leaning forward to look past Professor Lupin at the now completely black window. The words had hardly left him when the train started to slow down. Brilliant, said Ron, getting up and walking carefully past Professor Lupin to try and see outside. I'm starving. I want to get to the feast.
We can't be there yet,
said Hermione, checking her watch. So why are we stopping? The train was getting slower and slower. As the noise of the pistons fell away, the wind and rain sounded louder than ever against the windows. Harry, who was nearest the door, got up to look into the corridor. All along the carriage, heads were sticking curiously out of their compartments. The train came to a stop with a jolt, and distant thuds and bangs told him that luggage had fallen out of the racks. Then, without warning, all the lamps went out, and they were plunged into total darkness. What's going on? Said Ron's voice from behind Harry.
Ouch!
Gasped Hermione.
Ron, that was my foot!
Harry felt his way back to his seat. Do you think we've broken down? Don't know. There was a squeaking sound, and Harry saw the dim black outline of Ron, wiping a patch clean on the window and peering out. There's something moving out there, Ron said. I think people are coming aboard. The compartment door suddenly opened, and someone fell painfully over Harry's legs.
Sorry. Do you know what's going on? Ouch. Sorry. Oh, Neville,
said Harry, feeling around in the dark and pulling Neville up by his cloak.
Harry, is that you? What's happening?
No idea. Sit down. There was a loud hissing and a yelp of pain. Neville had tried to sit on Crookshanks.
I'm going to go and ask the driver what's going on,
came Hermione's voice. Harry felt her passing, heard the door slide open again, and then a thud, and 2 loud squeals of pain.
Who's that?
Who's that?
Ginny?
Hermione?
What are you doing?
I was looking for Ron.
Come inside and sit down.
Not here, said Harry hurriedly. I'm here. Ouch, said Neville. Quiet, said a hoarse voice suddenly. Professor Lupin appeared to have woken up at last. Harry could hear movements in the corner. None of them spoke. There was a soft, crackling noise, and a shivering light filled the compartment. Professor Lupin appeared to be holding a handful of flames. They illuminated his tired gray face, but his eyes looked alert and wary. Stay where you are, he said in the same hoarse voice, and he got slowly to his feet, with his handful of fire held out in front of him. But the door slid slowly open before Lupin could reach it. Standing in the doorway, illuminated by the shivering flames in Lupin's hand, was a cloaked figure that towered to the ceiling. Its face was completely hidden beneath its hood. Harry's eyes darted downwards, and what he saw made his stomach contract. There was a hand protruding from the cloak, and it was glistening, grayish, slimy-looking and scabbed, like something dead that had been decaying in water. It was visible only for a split second, as though the creature beneath the cloak sensed Harry's gaze. The hand was suddenly withdrawn into the folds of the black material, and then the thing beneath the hood, whatever it was, drew a long, slow, rattling breath, as though it was trying to suck something more than air from its surroundings. An intense cold swept over them all. Harry felt his own breath catch in his chest. The cold went deeper than his skin. It was inside his chest.
It was inside his very heart. Harry's eyes rolled up into his head. He couldn't see. He was drowning in cold. There was a rush in his ears, as though of water. He was being dragged downwards, the roaring growing louder. And then, far away, he heard screaming. Terrible, terrified, pleading screams.
Losing one's way.
He wanted to help
could be
whoever it
worse.
was. He tried to move his arms, but couldn't. A thick white fog was swirling around him, inside him. Harry, are you all right? Someone was slapping his face.
What?
Harry opened his eyes. There were lanterns above him, and the floor was shaking. The Hogwarts Express was moving again, and the lights had come back on. He seemed to have slid out of his seat onto the floor. Ron and Hermione were kneeling next to him, and above him he could see Neville and Professor Lupin watching. Harry felt very sick. When he put up his head to push his glasses back on, he felt cold sweat on his face. Ron and Hermione heaved him back onto his seat.
Are you okay?
Ron asked nervously. Yeah, said Harry, looking quickly towards the door. The hooded creature had vanished. What happened? Where's that thing? Who screamed?
No one screamed,
said Ron, more nervously still. Harry looked around the bright compartment. Ginny and Neville looked back at him, both very pale. But I heard screaming. A loud snap made them all jump. Professor Lupin was breaking an enormous slab of chocolate into pieces.
Here,
he said to Harry, handing him a particularly large piece.
Eat it. It'll help.
Harry took the chocolate but didn't eat it.
What was that thing?
He asked Lupin.
A Dementor,
said Lupin, who was now giving chocolate to everyone else.
One of the Dementors of Azkaban.
Everyone stared at him. Professor Lupin crumpled up the empty chocolate wrapper and put it in his pocket.
Eat,
he repeated.
It'll help. I need to speak to the driver. Excuse me.
He strolled past Harry and disappeared into the corridor. Are you sure you're okay, Harry? Said Hermione, watching Harry anxiously.
I don't get it. What happened?
Said Harry, wiping more sweat off his face. Well, that thing, the Dementor, stood there and looked around. I mean, I think it did. I couldn't see its face. And you...
I thought you were having a fit or something,
said Ron, who still looked scared.
You went sort of rigid and fell out of your seat and started twitching.
And Professor Lupin stepped over you and walked towards the Dementor and pulled out his wand, said Hermione. And he said, none of us is hiding Sirius Black under our cloaks. Go. But the Dementor didn't move, so Lupin muttered something, and a silvery thing shot out of his wand at it, and it turned around and sort of glided away.
It was horrible,
said Neville in a higher voice than usual.
Did you feel how cold it went when it came in? I felt weird,
said Ron, shifting his shoulders uncomfortably.
Like I'd never be cheerful again.
Ginny, who was huddled in her corner looking nearly as bad as Harry felt, gave a
You
small
must have been
sigh.
enticed by the delicious
Hermione went over
food
and
I'm
put a comforting
preparing.
arm around
Come
him.
in, come in. I will teach you the basics of
said
cooking.
Harry awkwardly.
No,
Said Ron, looking anxiously at Harry again.
Ginny was shaking like mad, though.
Harry didn't understand. He felt weak and shivery, as though he was recovering from a bad bout of flu. He also felt the beginnings of shame. Why had he gone to pieces like that, when no one else had? Professor Lupin had come back. He paused as he entered, looked around and said with a small smile,
I haven't poisoned that chocolate, you know.
Harry took a bite, and to his great surprise, felt warmth spread suddenly to the tips of his fingers and toes.
We'll be at Hogwarts in 10 minutes,
said Professor Lupin. Are you all right, Harry? Harry didn't ask how Professor Lupin knew his name. Fine, he muttered, embarrassed. They didn't talk much during the remainder of the journey. At long last, the train stopped at Hogsmeade Station, and there was a great scramble to get out. Owls hooted, cats meowed, and Neville's pet toad croaked loudly from under his hat. It was freezing on the tiny platform. Rain was driving down in icy sheets.
First year's this way,
called a familiar voice. Harry, Ron, and Hermione turned and saw the gigantic outline of Hagrid at the other end of the platform, beckoning the terrified-looking new students forward for their traditional journey across the lake.
All right, you three.
Hagrid yelled over the heads of the crowd. They waved at him, but had no chance to speak to him, because the mass of people around them was shunting them away along the platform. Harry, Ron, and Hermione followed the rest of the school out onto a rough mud track, where at last 100 stagecoaches awaited the remaining students, each pulled, Harry could only assume, by an invisible horse, because when they climbed inside one and shut the door, the coach set off all by itself, bumping and swaying in procession. The coach smelled faintly of mold and straw. Harry felt better since the chocolate, but still weak. Ron and Hermione kept looking at him sideways, as though frightened he might collapse again. As the carriage trundled towards a pair of magnificent wrought iron gates, flanked with stone columns, topped with winged boars, Harry saw 2 more towering, hooded Dementors, standing guard on either side. A wave of cold sickness threatened to engulf him again. He leaned back into the lumpy seat and closed his eyes until they had passed through the gates. The carriage picked up speed in the long, sloping drive up to the castle. Hermione was leaning out of the tiny window, watching the many turrets and towers draw nearer. At last, the carriage swayed to a halt, and Hermione and Ron got out. As Harry stepped down, a drawling, delighted voice sounded in his ear.
You fainted, Potter? Is Longbottom telling the truth? You actually fainted?
Malfoy elbowed past Hermione to block Harry's way up to those stone steps of the castle, his face gleeful and his pale eyes glinting maliciously.
Shove off, Malfoy,
said Ron, whose jaw was clenching.
Did you faint as well, Weasley?
Said Malfoy loudly.
Did the scary old Dementor frighten you too, Weasley?
Is there a problem?
Said a mild voice. Professor Lupin had just got out of the next carriage. Malfoy gave Professor Lupin an insolent stare, which took in the patches on his robes and the dilapidated suitcase. With a tiny hint of sarcasm in his voice, he said,
"Oh no, Professor."
Then he smirked at Crabbe and Goyle, and led them up the steps into the castle. Hermione prodded Ron in the back to make him hurry, and the 3 of them joined the crowd swarming up the steps, through the great oak front doors, and into the cavernous entrance hall, which was lit with flaming torches and housed a magnificent marble staircase, which led to the upper floors. The door into the great hall stood open at the right. Harry followed the crowd towards it, but had barely glimpsed the enchanted ceiling, which was black and cloudy tonight, when a voice called,
Potter, Granger, I want to see you both.
Harry and Hermione turned around, surprised. Professor McGonagall, Transfiguration teacher and head of Gryffindor House, was calling over the heads of the crowd. She was a stern-looking witch who wore her hair in a tight bun. Her sharp eyes were framed with square spectacles. Harry fought his way over to her with a feeling of foreboding. Professor McGonagall had a way of making him feel he must have done something wrong.
There's no need to look so worried. I just want a word in my office, she told them. Move along there, Weasley.
Ron stared as Professor McGonagall ushered Harry and Hermione away from the chattering crowd. They accompanied her across the entrance hall, up the marble staircase, and along a corridor. Once they were in her office, a small room with a large, welcoming fire, Professor McGonagall motioned Harry and Hermione to sit down. She settled herself behind her desk and said abruptly,
Professor Lupin sent an owl ahead to say that you were taken ill on the train, Potter.
Before Harry could reply, there was a soft knock on the door, and Madame Pomfrey, the matron, came bustling in. Harry felt himself going red in the face. It was bad enough that he passed out, or whatever he had done, without everyone making all this fuss.
I'm fine, he said. I don't need anything. Oh, it's you, is it?
Said Madame Pomfrey, ignoring this and bending down to stare closely at him.
I suppose you've been doing something dangerous again. He was a Dementor, Poppy,
said Professor McGonagall. They exchanged a dark look, and Madame Pomfrey clucked disapprovingly.
Setting Dementors around the school,
she muttered, pushing Harry's hair back and feeling his forehead.
He won't be the first one who collapses. Yes, he's all clammy. Terrible things they are, and the effect they have on people who are already delicate. I'm not delicate,
said Harry crossly.
Of course you're not, said Madame Pomfrey absent-mindedly, now taking his pulse. What does he need? Said Professor McGonagall crisply. Bed rest? Should he perhaps spend tonight in the hospital wing? I'm fine, said Harry, jumping up. The idea of what Draco Malfoy would say if he had to go to the hospital wing was torture. Well, you should have some chocolate at the very least, said Madame Pomfrey, who was now trying to peer into Harry's eyes. I've already had some, said Harry. Professor Lupin gave me some. He gave it to all of us. Did he now? Said Madame Pomfrey approvingly. So, we finally got a defense against the dark arts teacher, who knows his remedies. Are you sure you feel all right, Potter? Said Professor McGonagall sharply. Yes, said Harry. Very well. Kindly wait outside while I have a quick word with Miss Granger about her timetable. Then we can go down to the feast together. Harry went back into the corridor with Madame Pomfrey, who left for the hospital wing, muttering to herself. He only had to wait a few minutes, then Hermione emerged looking very happy about something, followed by Professor McGonagall, and the three of them made their way back down the marble staircase to the Great Hall. It was a sea of pointed black hats. Each of the long house tables was lined with students, their faces glimmering by the light of 1,000 candles, which were floating over the tables in mid-air. Professor McGonagall, who was a tiny little wizard, with a shock of white hair, was carrying an ancient hat and a 3-legged stool out of the hall.
Oh,
said Hermione softly.
we've missed the sorting.
New students at Hogwarts were sorted into houses by trying on the sorting hat, which shouted out the house they were best suited for: Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, Hufflepuff, or Slytherin. Professor McGonagall strode off towards her empty-seated staff table, and Harry and Hermione set off in the other direction, as quietly as possible, towards the Gryffindor table. People looked around at them as they passed along the back of the hall, and a few of them pointed at Harry. Had the story of him collapsing in front of the Dementor traveled that fast? He and Hermione sat down on either side of Ron, who had saved them seats.
What was all that about?
He muttered to Harry. Harry started to explain in a whisper, but at that moment the headmaster stood up to speak, and he broke off. Professor Dumbledore, though very old, always gave an impression of great energy. He had several feet of long silver hair and beard, half-moon spectacles, and an extremely crooked nose. He was often described as the greatest wizard of the age, but that wasn't why Harry respected him. He couldn't help trusting Albus Dumbledore, and as Harry watched him beaming around at students, he felt really calm for the first time since the Dementor had entered the train compartment. "Welcome," said Dumbledore, the candlelight shimmering on his beard. "Welcome to another year at Hogwarts. I've a few things to say to you all, and as one of them is very serious, I think it is best to get it out of the way before you become befuddled by our excellent feast." Dumbledore cleared his throat and continued. "As you will all be aware after their search of the Hogwarts Express, our school is presently playing host to some of the Dementors of Azkaban, who are here on Ministry of Magic business." He paused. And Harry
Each foundation and wall you lay counts towards building your stronghold. Even a base built from the simplest materials could help to keep you safe from the wilderness.
"And while they are here with us, I must make it plain that nobody is to leave school without permission. Dementors are not to be fooled by tricks or disguises, or even invisibility cloaks," he added blandly. And Harry and Ron glanced at each other. "It is not in the nature of a Dementor to understand pleading or excuses. I therefore warn each and every one of you to give them no reason to harm you. I look to the prefects and our new head boy and girl to make sure that no student runs foul of the Dementors." Percy, who was sitting a few seats along from Harry, puffed out his chest again and stared around impressively. Dumbledore paused again. He looked very seriously around the hall, and nobody moved or made a sound. "On a happier note," he continued, "I am pleased to welcome 2 new teachers to our ranks this year. Firstly, Professor Lupin, who has kindly consented to fill the post of Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher." There was some scattered, rather unenthusiastic applause. Only those who had been in the compartment on the train with Professor Lupin clapped hard, Harry among them. Professor Lupin looked particularly shabby next to all the other teachers in their best robes.
Look at Snape,
Ron hissed in Harry's ear. Professor Snape, the potions master, was staring along the staff table at Professor Lupin. It was common knowledge that Snape wanted the Defense Against the Dark Arts job, but even Harry, who hated Snape, was startled at the expression twisting his thin, shallow face. It was beyond anger. It was loathing. Harry knew that expression only too well. It was the look Snape wore every time he set eyes on Harry. As to our second new appointment, Dumbledore continued, as the lukewarm applause for Professor Lupin died away. Well, I am sorry to tell you that Professor Kettleburn, our Care of Magical Creatures teacher, retired at the end of last year in order to enjoy more time with his remaining limbs. However, I am delighted to say that his place will be filled by none other than Rubeus Hagrid, who has agreed to take on this teaching job in addition to his gamekeeping duties. Harry, Ron, and Hermione stared at each other, stunned. Then they joined in with the applause, which was tumultuous at the Gryffindor table in particular. Harry leaned forward to see Hagrid, who was ruby red in the face and staring down at his enormous hands, his wide grin hidden in the tangle of his black beard.
We should have known, Ron roared, pounding the table. Who else would have sent us a biting book?
Harry, Ron, and Hermione were the last to stop clapping, and as Professor Dumbledore started speaking again, they saw that Hagrid was wiping his eyes on the tablecloth. Well, I think that's everything of importance, said Dumbledore. Let the feast begin. The golden plates and goblets before them filled suddenly with food and drink. Harry, suddenly ravenous, helped himself to everything he could reach and began to eat. It was a delicious feast. The hall echoed with talk, laughter, and the clatter of knives and forks. Harry, Ron, and Hermione, however, were eager for it to finish, so that they could talk to Hagrid. They knew how much being made a teacher would mean to him. Hagrid wasn't a fully qualified wizard. He had been expelled from Hogwarts in his 3rd year, for a crime he had not committed. It had been Harry, Ron, and Hermione who had cleared Hagrid's name last year. At long last, when the last morsels of pumpkin tart had melted from the golden platters, Dumbledore gave the word that it was time for them all to go to bed, and they got their chance.
Congratulations, Hagrid, Hermione squealed as they reached the teacher's table.
All down to you 3,
said Hagrid, wiping his shining face on his napkin as he looked up at them.
Can't believe it. Great man, Dumbledore. Came straight down to me hut after Professor Kettleburn said he'd had enough. That's what I always wanted.
Overcome with emotion, he buried his face in his napkin, and Professor McGonagall shooed them away. Harry, Ron, and Hermione joined the Gryffindors, streaming up the marble staircase. And, very tired now, along more corridors, up more and more stairs, to the hidden entrance to Gryffindor Tower. A large portrait of a fat lady in a pink dress asked them, "Password?" Coming through, Percy called from behind the crowd. "The new password's Fortuna Major." "Oh no," said Neville Longbottom sadly. He always had trouble remembering the passwords. Through the portrait hole and across the common room, the girls and boys divided towards their separate staircases. Harry climbed the spiral stairs, with no thought in his head, except how glad he was to be back. They reached their familiar circular dormitory, with its 5 four-poster beds, and Harry, looking around, felt he was home at last. Chapter 6. Talons and Tea Leaves. When Harry, Ron, and Hermione entered the Great Hall for breakfast next day, the first thing they saw was Draco Malfoy, who seemed to be entertaining a large group of Slytherins with a very funny story. As they passed, Malfoy did a ridiculous impression of a swooning fit, and there was a roar of laughter.
"Ignore him,"
said Hermione, who was right behind Harry.
"Just ignore him. It's not worth it."
"Hey, Potter!" shrieked Pansy Parkinson, a Slytherin girl with a face like a pug. "Potter! The Dementors are coming! Potter! Ooh!" Harry dropped into a seat at the Gryffindor table, next to George Weasley.
"New 3rd year timetables,"
said George, passing them over.
What's up with you, Harry? Malfoy, said Ron, sitting down on George's other side and glaring over at the Slytherin table. George looked up in time to see Malfoy pretending to faint with terror again. That little git, he said calmly. He wasn't so cocky last night when the Dementors were down our end of the train. Came running into our compartment, didn't he, Fred? Nearly wet himself, said Fred, with a contemptuous gaze at Malfoy. I wasn't too happy myself, said George. They're horrible, those Dementors. Sort of freeze your insides, don't they? Said Fred. You didn't pass out, though, did you? Said Harry in a low voice. Forget it, Harry, said George bracingly. Dad had to go to Azkaban one time, remember, Fred? And he said it was the worst place he'd ever been to. He came back all weak and shaking. They suck the happiness out of a place, Dementors. Most of the prisoners go mad in there. Anyway, we'll see how happy Malfoy looks after our first Quidditch match, said George. Gryffindor vs. Slytherin, first game of the season, remember? The only time Harry and Malfoy had faced each other in a Quidditch match, Malfoy had definitely come off worse. Feeling slightly more cheerful, Harry helped himself to sausages and fried tomatoes. Hermione was examining her new timetable.
Oh, good. We're starting some new subjects today,
she said happily.
Hermione, said Ron, frowning as he looked over her shoulder. They've messed up your timetable. Look, they've got you down for about 10 subjects a day. There isn't enough time.
I'll manage. I fixed it all with Professor McGonagall.
But look, said Ron, laughing. See this morning? 9 o'clock, divination. And underneath, 9 o'clock, Muggle studies. And...
Ron leaned closer to the timetable, disbelieving.
Look, underneath that, arithmancy, 9 o'clock. I mean, I know you're good, Hermione, but no one's that good. How are you supposed to be in 3 classes at once?
Don't be silly,
said Hermione shortly.
Of course I won't be in 3 classes at once.
Well then...
Pass the marmalade,
said Hermione.
But...
Oh, Ron, what's it to you if my timetable's a bit full?
Hermione snapped.
I told you, I fixed it all with Professor McGonagall.
Just then, Hagrid entered the Great Hall. He was wearing his long moleskin overcoat, and was absent-mindedly swinging a dead polecat from one enormous hand.
All right,
he said eagerly, pausing on the way to the staff table.
You're my first ever lesson, right after lunch. Been up since 5, getting everything ready. Hope it's okay. Me, a teacher, honestly.
He grinned broadly at them and headed off to the staff table, still swinging the polecat.
Wonder what he's been getting ready,
said Ron, a note of anxiety in his voice. The hall was starting to empty as people headed off towards their first lessons. Ron checked his timetable.
We'd better go. Looks like divination's at the top of North Tower. It'll take us 10 minutes to get there.
They finished their breakfast hastily, said goodbye to Fred and George, and walked back through the hall. As they passed the Slytherin table, Malfoy did yet another impression of a fainting fit. The shouts of laughter followed Harry into the entrance hall. The journey through the castle to North Tower was a long one. 2 years at Hogwarts hadn't taught them everything about the castle, and they had never been inside North Tower before.
Magic is plentiful in this world. Take advantage of this abundance and collect a surplus for future use. You might learn something in the process.
And emerged on an unfamiliar landing, where there was nothing but a large painting of a bare stretch of grass hanging on a stone wall.
I think it's this way,
said Hermione, peering down the empty passage to the right.
Can't be,
said Ron.
That's south. Look, you can see a bit of the lake out of the window.
Harry was watching the painting. A fat, dappled gray pony had just ambled onto the grass and was grazing nonchalantly. Harry was used to the subjects of Hogwarts paintings moving around and leaving their frames to visit each other, but he always enjoyed watching them. A moment later...
Halt, reckless adventurer! You are about to step into the territory of Arcadia.
By the look of the grass stains on his metal knees, he had just fallen off.
Ah!
He yelled, seeing Harry run Hermione.
What villains are these that trespass upon my private lands? Come to scorn at my fall, perchance? Draw your knaves, you dogs! They watched in astonishment as the little knight tugged his sword out of his scabbard and began brandishing it violently, hopping up and down in rage. But the sword was too long for him. A particularly wild swing made him overbalance, and he landed face down in the grass. "Are you all right?" said Harry, moving closer to the picture. "Get back, you scurvy braggart! Back, you rogue!" The knight seized his sword again and used it to push himself back up, but the blade sank deeply into the grass, and though he pulled with all his might, he couldn't get it out again. Finally, he had to flop back down to the grass and push up his visor to mop his sweating face. "Listen," said Harry, taking advantage of the knight's exhaustion. "We're looking for the North Tower. You don't know the way, do you?" "A quest?" The knight's rage seemed to have vanished instantly. He clanked to his feet and shouted, "Come follow me, dear friends, and we shall find our goal, or else shall perish bravely in the charge." He gave the sword another fruitless tug, tried and failed to mount the fat pony, and cried, "On foot then, good sirs and gentle lady, on, on!" And he ran, clanking loudly, in the left-hand side of the frame, and out of sight. They hurried after him along the corridor, following the sound of his armor. Every now and then they spotted him running through a picture ahead. "Be of stout heart, the worst is yet to come," yelled the knight. And they saw him reappear in front of an alarmed group of women and crinolines, whose picture hung on a wall of a narrow spiral staircase. Puffing loudly, Harry, Ron, and Hermione climbed the tightly spiraling steps, getting dizzier and dizzier, till at last they heard the murmur of voices above them, and knew they had reached the classroom. "Farewell!" cried the knight, popping his head into a painting of some sinister-looking monks. "Farewell, my comrades in arms! If you ever have need of a noble heart and steely sinner, call upon Sir Cadogan." "Yeah, we'll call you," muttered Ron, as the knight disappeared. "If we ever need someone mental." They climbed the last few steps and emerged onto a tiny landing where most of the class was already assembled. There were no doors off this landing. Ron nudged Harry and pointed at the ceiling, where there was a circular trapdoor with a brass plaque on it. "Sybil Trelawney, divination teacher," Harry read. "How are we supposed to get up there?" As though in answer to his question, the trapdoor suddenly opened, and a silvery ladder descended right at Harry's feet. Everyone went quiet. "After you," said Ron, grinning, so Harry climbed the ladder first. He emerged into the strangest-looking classroom he had ever seen. In fact, it didn't look like a classroom at all, more like a cross between someone's attic and an old-fashioned tea shop. At least 20 small circular tables were cramped inside it, all surrounded by armchairs and fat little poofs. Everything was lit with a dim, crimson light. The curtains at the windows were all closed, and the many lamps were draped with dark red scarves. It was stiflingly warm, and the fire which was burning under the crowded mantelpiece was giving off a heavy, sickly sort of perfume as it heated a large copper kettle. The shelves running around the circular walls, with dusty-looking feathers, stubs of candles, many packs of tattered playing cards, countless silvery crystal balls, and a huge array of teacups. Ron appeared at Harry's shoulder as the class assembled around them, all talking in whispers. "Where is she?" Ron said. A voice came suddenly out of the shadows, a soft, misty sort of voice. "Welcome,"
Right.
it said.
I need a mortar.
"How nice
Pestle.
to see you
Right.
in the physical world at last." Harry's immediate impression was of a large, glittering insect. Professor Trelawney moved into the firelight, and they saw that she was very thin.
Her large glasses magnified her eyes to several times the natural size, and she was draped in a gauzy spangled shawl. Innumerable chains and beads hung around her spindly neck, and her arms and hands were encrusted with bangles and rings.
"Sit, my children, sit,"
she said, and they all climbed awkwardly into armchairs or sank on poofs. Harry, Ron, and Hermione sat themselves around the same round table.
"Welcome to divination,"
said Professor Trelawney, who had seated herself in a winged armchair in front of the fire.
"My name is Professor Trelawney. You may not have seen me before. I find that descending too often into the hustle and bustle of the main school clouds my inner eye."
Nobody said anything in answer to this extraordinary pronouncement. Professor Trelawney delicately rearranged her shawl and continued.
"So, you have chosen to study divination, the most difficult of all magical arts. I must warn you at the outset that if you do not have the sight, there is very little I will be able to teach you. Books can take you only so far in this field."
At those words, both Harry and Ron glanced, grinning, at Hermione, who looked startled at the news that books wouldn't be much help in this subject.
"Many witches and wizards, talented though they are in the area of loud bangs and smells and sudden disappearings, are yet unable to penetrate the veiled mysteries of the future,"
Professor Trelawney went on, her enormous, gleaming eyes moving from face to nervous face.
"It is a gift granted to few. You, boy,"
she said suddenly to Neville, who almost toppled off his poof.
"Is your grandmother well?"
I think so," said Neville nervously.
"I wouldn't be so sure if I were you, dear,"
said Professor Trelawney, the firelight glinting on her long emerald earrings. Neville gulped. Professor Trelawney continued placidly.
"We will be covering the basic methods of divination this year. The first term will be devoted to reading the tea leaves. Next term, we shall progress to palmistry. By the way, my dear,"
she shot suddenly at Parvati Patil,
"beware a red-haired man."
Parvati gave a startled look at Ron, who was right behind her, and edged her chair away from him.
"In the summer term,"
Professor Trelawney went on,
"we shall progress to the crystal ball. If we have finished with fire omens, that is. Unfortunately, classes will be disrupted in February by a nasty bout of flu. I myself will lose my voice, and around Easter, one of our number will leave us forever."
A very tense silence followed this pronouncement, but Professor Trelawney seemed unaware of it.
"I wonder, dear,"
she said to Lavender Brown, who was nearest and shrank back in her chair,
"if you could pass me the largest silver teapot."
Lavender looked relieved, stood up, took an enormous teapot from the shelf, and put it down on the table in front of Professor Trelawney.
"Thank you, my dear. Incidentally, that thing you are dreading, it will happen on Friday the 16th of October.
Lavender trembled.
"Now, I want you all to divide into pairs. Collect a teacup from the shelf. Come to me and I will fill it. Then sit down and drink. Drink until only the dregs remain. Swill these around the cup 3 times with the left hand. Then turn the cup upside down on its saucer. Wait for the last of the tea to drain away. Then turn the cup upside down on its saucer. Wait for the last of the tea to drain away. Then give your cup to your partner to read. You will interpret the patterns using pages 5 and 6 of Unfogging the Future. I shall move among you, helping and instructing. Oh, and dear," she caught Neville by the arm, as he made to stand up. "After you've broken your first cup, would you be so kind as to select one of the blue patterned ones? I'm rather attached to the pink." Sure enough, Neville had no sooner reached the shelf of teacups when there was a tinkle of breaking china. Professor Trelawney swept over to him, holding a dustpan and broom, and said, "One of the blue ones then, dear, if you wouldn't mind. Thank you." When Harry and Ron had had their teacups filled, they went back to their table and tried to drink the scalding tea quickly. They swilled the dregs around as Professor Trelawney had instructed, then drained the cups and swapped them. "Right," said Ron, as they both opened their books to pages 5 and 6. "What can you see in mine?" "A lot of soggy brown stuff," said Harry. The heavily perfumed smoke in the room was making him feel sleepy and stupid. "Broaden your minds, my dears, and allow your eyes to see past the mundane," Professor Trelawney cried through the gloom. Harry tried to pull himself together. "Right, you've got a wonky sort of cross," he said, consulting Unfogging the Future. "That means you're going to have trials and suffering. Sorry about that. But there's a thing that could be the sun. Hang on. That means great happiness? So you're gonna suffer, but be very happy." "Need your inner eye tested if you ask me," said Ron, and they both had to stifle their laughs as Professor Trelawney gazed in their direction. "My turn." Ron peered into Harry's teacup, his forehead wrinkling with effort. "There's a blob, a bit like a bowler hat," he said. "Maybe you're gonna work for the Ministry of Magic." He turned the teacup the other way. "But this way it looks more like an acorn. What's that?" He scanned his copy of Unfogging the Future. "Windfall, unexpected gold. Excellent, you can lend me some. And there's a thing here," he turned the cup again, "that looks like an animal. Yeah, if that was the head. It looks like a hippo. No, sheep?" Professor Trelawney whirled around as his hair let out a snort of laughter. "Let me see, my dear," she said reprovingly to Ron, sweeping over and snatching Harry's cup from him. Everyone went quiet to watch. Professor Trelawney was staring into the teacup, rotating it anti-clockwise. "The falcon. My dear, you have a deadly enemy."
"But everyone knows that,"
said Hermione in a loud whisper. Professor Trelawney stared at her.
"Well, they do,"
said Hermione.
"Everybody knows about Harry and you-know-who."
Harry and Ron stared at her with a mixture of amazement and admiration. They had never heard Hermione speak to a teacher like that before. Professor Trelawney chose not to reply. She lowered her huge eyes to Harry's cup again and continued to turn it. "The club. On attack. Dear, dear, this is not a happy cup." "I thought that was a bowler hat," said Ron sheepishly. "The skull. Danger in your path, my dear." Everyone was staring, transfixed, at Professor Trelawney, who gave the cup a final turn, gasped, and then screamed. There was another tinkle of breaking china. Neville had smashed his second cup. Professor Trelawney sank into a vacant armchair, her glittering hand at her heart, and her eyes closed. "My dear boy, my poor dear boy, no. It is kinder not to say, no, do not ask me." "What is it, Professor?" asked Dean Thomas at once. Everyone got to their feet, and slowly they crowded around Harry and Ron's table, pressing close to Professor Trelawney's chair to get a good look at Harry's cup. "My dear," Professor Trelawney's huge eyes opened dramatically, "you have the Grim." "The what?" said Harry. He could tell that he wasn't the only one who didn't understand. Dean Thomas shrugged at him
and Lavender Brown looked puzzled, but nearly everybody else clapped their hands to their mouths in horror. "The Grim, my dear, the Grim!" cried Professor Trelawney, who looked shocked that Harry hadn't understood. "The giant spectral dog that haunts churchyards, my dear boy. It is an omen, the worst omen of death." Harry's stomach lurched. That dog on the cover of Death Omens in Flourish and Blots. The dog in the shadows of Magnolia Crescent. Lavender Brown clapped her hands to her mouth, too. Everyone was looking at Harry. Everyone except Hermione, who had got up and moved around to the back of Professor Trelawney's chair.
"I don't think it looks like a Grim,"
she said flatly. Professor Trelawney surveyed Hermione with mounting dislike. "You'll forgive me to say so, my dear, but I perceive very little aura around you. Very little receptivity to the resonance of the future." Seamus Finnegan was tilting his head from side to side. "Looks like a Grim if you do this," he said, with his eyes almost shut. "But it looks more like a donkey from here," he said, leaning to the left. "When you've all finished deciding whether I'm going to die or not," said Harry, taking even himself by surprise. Now nobody seemed to want to look at him. "I think we will leave the lesson here for today," said Professor Trelawney, in her mistiest voice. "Yes, please pack away your things." Silently, the class took their teacups back to Professor Trelawney, packed away their books, and closed their bags. Even Ron was avoiding Harry's eyes. "Until we meet again," said Professor Trelawney, faintly. "Fair fortune be yours. Oh, and dear," she pointed at Neville, "you'll be late next time, so mind you work extra hard to catch up." Harry, Ron, and Hermione descended Professor Trelawney's ladder, and the winding staircase in silence, then set off for Professor McGonagall's Transfiguration lesson. It took them so long to find her classroom that, early as they had left divination, they were still only just in time. Harry chose a seat right at the back of the room, feeling as though he was sitting in a very bright spotlight. The rest of the class kept shooting furtive glances at him, as though he was about to drop dead at any moment. He hardly heard what Professor McGonagall was telling them about animagi, wizards who could transform at will into animals, and wasn't even watching when she transformed herself in front of their eyes into a tabby cat, with spectacle markings around her eyes. "Really, what has gotten into you all today?" said Professor McGonagall, turning back into herself with a faint pop, and staring around at them all. "Not that it matters, but that's the first time my transformation's not gotten applause from a class." Everybody's heads turned towards Harry again, but nobody spoke. Then Hermione raised her hand.
"Please, Professor, we've just had our first divination class, and we were reading the tea leaves, and—"
"Ah, of course," said Professor McGonagall, suddenly frowning. "There is no need to say any more, Miss Granger. Tell me, which of you will be dying this year?" Everyone stared at her. "Me," said Harry finally. "I see," said Professor McGonagall, fixing Harry with her beady eyes. "Then you should know, Potter, that Sybil Trelawney has predicted the death of one student a year since she arrived at the school. None of them has died yet. Seeing death omens is her favourite way of getting in a new class. If it were not for the fact that I never speak ill of my colleagues—" Professor McGonagall broke off, and they saw that her nostrils had gone white. She went on more calmly. "Divination is one of the most imprecise branches of magic. I shall not conceal from you that I have very little patience with it. True seers are very rare, and Professor Trelawney—" She stopped again, and then said, in a very matter-of-fact tone, "You look in excellent health to me, Potter, so you will excuse me if I don't let you off homework today. I assure you that if you die, you need not hand it in." Hermione laughed. Harry felt a bit better. It was harder to feel scared of a lump of tea leaves away from the dim red light and befuddling perfume of Professor Trelawney's classroom. Not everyone was convinced, however. Ron still looked worried. And Lavender whispered, But what about Neville's cup? When the Transfiguration class had finished, they joined the crowd thundering towards the Great Hall for lunch.
Ron, cheer up.
The wild beasts of the land are adversaries and an obstacle to your cause, but they are not necessarily evil in their nature.
Ron stew onto his plate and picked up his fork, but didn't start.
Harry,
He said in a low, serious voice.
you haven't seen a great black dog anywhere, have you?
Yeah, I have, said Harry. I saw one the night I left the Dursleys. Ron let his fork fall with a clatter.
Probably a stray,
said Hermione calmly. Ron looked at Hermione as though she had gone mad.
Hermione, if Harry's seen a Grim, that's bad,
he said.
My Uncle Billy saw one, and he died 24 hours later.
coincidence.
Said Hermione airily, pouring herself some pumpkin juice.
I don't know what you're talking about,
said Ron, starting to get angry.
Grim scared the living daylights out of most wizards.
And there you are then,
said Hermione in a superior tone.
They see the Grim and die of fright. The Grim's not an omen. It's the cause of death. And Harry's still with us because he's not stupid enough to see one and think, right, well, I'd better pop my clogs then.
Ron mouthed wordlessly at Hermione, who opened her bag, took out her new arithmetic book, and propped it open against the juice jug.
I think divination seems very woolly,
she said, searching for her page.
A lot of guesswork, if you ask me.
There was nothing woolly about the Grim in that cup,
said Ron hotly.
You didn't seem quite so confident when you were telling Harry it was a sheep,
said Hermione coolly.
Professor Trelawney said you didn't have the right aura. You just don't like being rubbish at something for a change.
He had touched a nerve. Hermione slammed her arithmetic book down on the table, so hard that bits of meat and carrot flew everywhere.
If being good at divination means I have to pretend to see death omens in a lump of tea leaves, I'm not sure I'll be studying it much longer. That lesson was absolute rubbish compared to my arithmetic class.
She snatched up her bag and walked away. Ron frowned at her.
What's she talking about?
He said to Harry.
She hasn't been to an arithmetic class yet.
Harry was pleased to get out of the castle after lunch. Yesterday's rain had cleared. The sky was a clear, pale grey, and the grass was springy and damp underfoot as they set off for their first Care of Magical Creatures class. Ron and Hermione weren't speaking to each other. Harry walked beside them in silence as they went down the sloping lawns to Hagrid's hut on the edge of the Forbidden Forest. It was only when he spotted only two familiar backs ahead of them that they realized they must be having their lessons with the Slytherins. Malfoy was talking animatedly to Crabbe and Goyle, who were chuckling. Harry was quite sure he knew what they were talking about. Hagrid was waiting for his class at the door of his hut. He stood in his moleskin overcoat, with Fang the boarhound at his heels, looking impatient to start.
Come on now, get a move on,
he said as the class approached.
Got a real treat for you today. Great lesson coming up. Everyone here? Right, follow me.
For one nasty moment, Harry thought that Hagrid was going to lead them into the forest. Harry had enough unpleasant experiences in there to last him a lifetime. However, Hagrid strolled off around the edge of the trees, and 5 minutes later, they found themselves outside a kind of paddock. There was nothing in there.
Everyone gather around the fence here,
he called.
That's it. Make sure you can see. Now, first thing you'll want to do is open your books.
How? Said the cold, drawling voice of Draco Malfoy.
Eh?
Said Hagrid.
How do we open our books?
Malfoy repeated. He took out his copy of the Monster Book of Monsters, which he had bound shut with a length of rope. Other people took theirs out too. Some, like Harry, had belted their books shut. Others had crammed them inside tight bags or clamped them together with bull clips.
Hasn't anyone been able to open their books?
Said Hagrid, looking crestfallen. The class all shook their heads.
You've got to stroke 'em,
said Hagrid, as though this was the most obvious thing in the world.
Look.
He took Hermione's copy and ripped off the sellotape that bound it. The book tried to bite, but Hagrid ran a giant forefinger down its spine and the book shivered, and then fell open and lay quiet in his hand.
Oh, how silly we've all been,
Malfoy sneered.
We should have stroked them. Why didn't we guess?
I thought they were funny.
Hagrid said uncertainly to Hermione.
Oh, tremendously funny,
said Malfoy.
Really witty, giving us books that try and rip our hands off.
Shut up, Malfoy, said Harry quietly. Hagrid was looking downcast, and Harry wanted Hagrid's first lesson to be a success.
Right then,
said Hagrid, who seemed to have lost his thread.
So you've got your books and now you need the magical creatures. Yeah. So I'll go and get 'em. Hang on.
He strode away from them into the forest, and out of sight.
God, this place is really going to the dogs,
said Malfoy loudly.
That oaf teaching classes? My father'll have a fit when I tell him.
Shut up, Malfoy, Harry repeated.
Careful, Potter. There's a Dementor behind you.
Oh! Squealed Lavender Brown, pointing towards the opposite side of the paddock. Trotting towards them were a dozen of the most bizarre creatures Harry had ever seen. They had the bodies, hind legs, and tails of horses, but the front legs, wings, and heads of what seemed to be a giant eagle, with cruel steel-colored beaks and large, brilliantly orange eyes. The talons on their front legs were half a foot long and deadly looking. Each of the beasts had a thick leather collar around its neck, which was attached to a long chain, and the ends of all these were held in the vast hands of Hagrid, who came jogging into the paddock behind the creatures.
Get up there,
he roared, shaking the chains and urging the creatures towards the fence where the class stood. Everyone drew back slightly as Hagrid reached them and tethered the creatures to the fence.
Hippogriffs,
Hagrid roared happily, waving a hand at them.
Beautiful, aren't they?
Harry could sort of see what Hagrid meant. Once he got over the first shock of seeing something that was half horse, half bird, he started to appreciate the hippogriffs' gleaming coats, changing smoothly from feathers to hair, each of them a different color: stormy gray, bronze, a pinkish roan, gleaming chestnut, and inky black.
So,
said Hagrid, rubbing his hands together and beaming around,
if you want to come a bit nearer.
No one seemed to want to. Harry, Ron, and Hermione, however, approached the fence cautiously.
Now, first thing you gotta know about hippogriffs is they're proud,
said Hagrid.
Easily offended hippogriffs are. Don't never insult one, 'cause it might be the last thing you do.
Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle weren't listening. They were talking in an undertone, and Harry had a nasty feeling they were plotting how best to disrupt the lesson.
You always wait for the hippogriff to make the first move,
Hagrid continued.
It's polite, see? You walk towards them, and you bow, and you wait. If he bows back, you're allowed to touch him. If he doesn't bow, then get away from him sharpish, 'cause those talons hurt. Right, who wants to go first?
Most of the class backed further away in answer. Even Harry, Ron, and Hermione had misgivings. The hippogriffs were tossing their fierce heads and flexing their powerful wings. They didn't seem to like being tethered like this.
No one?
Said Hagrid with a pleading look.
I'll do it,
said Harry. There was an intake of breath from behind him, and both Lavender and Parvati whispered, "Oh no, Harry, remember your tea leaves!" Harry ignored them. He climbed over the paddock fence.
Good man, Harry,
roared Hagrid.
Right then, let's see how you get on with Buckbeak.
He untied one of the chains, pulled the grey hippogriff away from his fellows, and slipped off the leather collar. The class on the other side of the paddock seemed to be holding its breath. Malfoy's eyes narrowed maliciously.
Easy now, Harry,
said Hagrid quietly.
You got eye contact? Now, try not to blink. Hippogriffs don't trust you if you blink too much.
Harry's eyes immediately began to water, but he didn't shut them. Buckbeak had turned its great sharp head and was staring at him with one fierce orange eye.
That's it,
said Hagrid.
That's it, Harry. Now, bow.
Harry didn't feel much like exposing the back of his neck to Buckbeak, but he did as he was told. He gave a short bow and then looked up. The hippogriff was still staring hauntingly at him. It didn't move. "Ah," said Hagrid, sounding worried. "Right. Back away now, Harry. Easy does it." But then, to Harry's enormous surprise, the hippogriff suddenly bent his scaly front knees and sank into what was an unmistakable bow. "Well done, Harry," said Hagrid, ecstatic. "Right. You can touch him. Pat his beak. Go on." Feeling that a better reward would have been to back away, Harry moved slowly towards the hippogriff and reached out towards him. He patted the beak several times, and the hippogriff closed his eyes lazily, as though enjoying it. The class broke into applause, all except for Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle, who were looking deeply disappointed. "Right then, Harry," said Hagrid. "I reckon you might let you ride him." This was more than Harry had bargained for. He was used to a broomstick, but he wasn't sure a hippogriff would be quite the same. "Climb up there, just behind the wing joint," said Hagrid. "And mind you don't pull any of his feathers out. You won't like that." Harry put his foot on top of Buckbeak's wing and hoisted himself onto his back. Buckbeak stood up. Harry wasn't sure where to hold on. Everything in front of him was covered in feathers. "Go on, then," roared Hagrid, slapping the hippogriff's hindquarters. Without warning, 12-foot wings flapped open on either side of Harry. He just had time to seize the hippogriff around the neck before he was soaring upwards. It was nothing like a broomstick, and Harry knew which one he preferred. The hippogriff's wings were beating uncomfortably on either side of him, catching him under his legs, and making him feel he was about to be thrown off. The glossy feathers slipped under his fingers, and he didn't dare get a stronger grip. Instead of the smooth action of his Nimbus 2000, he was now feeling himself rocking backwards and forwards as the hindquarters of the hippogriff rose and fell with the wings. Buckbeak flew him once around the paddock, and then headed back to the ground. This was the bit Harry had been dreading. He leaned back as his smooth neck lowered, feeling he was going to slip over the beak. Then he felt a heavy thud as the 4 ill-assorted feet hit the ground, and just managed to hold on and push himself straight again. "Good work, Harry," roared Hagrid, as everyone except Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle cheered. "Okay, who else wants to go?" Emboldened by Harry's success, the rest of the class climbed cautiously into the paddock. Hagrid untied the hippogriffs one by one, and soon people were bowing nervously all over the paddock. Neville ran repeatedly backwards from his, which didn't seem to want to bend its knees. Ron and Hermione practiced on the chestnut, while Harry watched. Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle had taken over Buckbeak. It had bowed to Malfoy, who was now patting his beak, looking disdainful.
This is very easy,
Malfoy drawled, loud enough for Harry to hear him.
"I knew it must have been, if Potter could do it." "I bet you're not dangerous at all, are you?"
he said to the hippogriff.
"Are you, you ugly great brute?"
It happened in a flash of steely talons. Malfoy let out a high-pitched scream, and next moment, Hagrid was wrestling Buckbeak back into his collar, as he strained to get at Malfoy, who laid curled in the grass, blood blossoming over his robes.
"I'm dying!"
Malfoy yelled, as the class panicked.
"I'm dying! Look at me! It killed me!"
"You're not dying," said Hagrid, who had gone very white. "Someone help me. Gotta get him out of here." Hermione ran to open the gate, while Hagrid lifted Malfoy easily. As they passed, Harry saw that there was a long, deep gash in Malfoy's arm. Blood splattered the grass, and Hagrid ran with him, up the slope towards the castle. Very shaken, the Care of Magical Creatures class followed at a walk. The Slytherins were all shouting about Hagrid. "They should sack him straight away," said Pansy Parkinson, who was in tears. "It was Malfoy's fault," snapped Dean Thomas. Crabbe and Goyle flexed their muscles threateningly. They all climbed the stone steps into the deserted entrance hall. "I'm going to see if he's okay," said Pansy, and they all watched her run up the marble staircase. The Slytherins, still muttering about Hagrid, headed away in the direction of their dungeon common room. Harry, Ron, and Hermione proceeded upstairs to Gryffindor Tower.
"Do you think he'll be all right?"
said Hermione nervously. "Of course he will. Madame Pomfrey can mend cuts in about a second," said Harry. who had far worse injuries mended magically by the matron.
It was a really bad thing to happen in Hagrid's first lesson, though, wasn't it?
Said Ron, looking worried.
Trust Malfoy to mess things up for him.
They were among the first to reach the Great Hall at dinner time, hoping to see Hagrid, but he wasn't there.
They wouldn't sack him, would they?
Said Hermione anxiously, not touching her steak and kidney pudding.
They'd better not,
said Ron, who wasn't eating either. Harry was watching the Slytherin table. A large group, including Crabbe and Goyle, were huddled together, deep in conversation. Harry was sure they were cooking up their own version of how Malfoy got injured.
Well, you can't say it wasn't an interesting first day back,
said Ron gloomily. They went up to the crowded Gryffindor common room after dinner, and tried to do the homework Professor McGonagall had set them, but all three of them kept breaking off and glancing out of the tower window. There's a light on Hagrid's window, Harry said suddenly. Ron looked at his watch.
If we hurried, we could go down and see him. It's still quite early.
I don't know,
Hermione said slowly, and Harry saw her glance at him. I'm allowed to walk across the grounds, he said pointedly. Sirius Black hasn't got past the Dementors here, has he? So they put their things away and headed out of the portrait hole, glad not to meet anybody on their way to the front doors, as they weren't entirely sure they were supposed to be out. The grass was still wet and looked almost black in the twilight. When they reached Hagrid's hut, they knocked, and a voice growled, "Come in." Hagrid was sitting in his shirt sleeves, at his scrubbed wooden table. His boarhound, Fang, had his head in Hagrid's lap. One look told him that Hagrid had been drinking a lot. There was a pewter tankard, almost as big as a bucket in front of him, and he seemed to be having difficulty getting them into focus.
"Spec it's a record,"
he said thickly, when he recognized them.
"Don't reckon they've ever had a teacher who only lasted a day before."
You haven't been sacked, Hagrid,
gasped Hermione.
"Not yet,"
said Hagrid miserably, taking a huge gulp of whatever was in the tankard.
"It's only a matter of time, isn't it? After Malfoy." "How is he?"
said Ron, as they all sat down.
"Wasn't serious, was it?" "Madame Pomfrey fixed him best she could,"
said Hagrid dully.
"But he's saying it's still agony. Covered in bandages, moaning."
"He's faking it," said Harry at once. "Madame Pomfrey can mend anything. She grew half my bones last year. Trust Malfoy to milk it for all it's worth."
"School governors have been told, of course,"
said Hagrid miserably.
"They reckon I started too big. Just left hippogriffs for later. Didn't flubber worms or something. Just thought I'd make a good first lesson. It's all my fault."
It's all Malfoy's fault, Hagrid,
said Hermione earnestly. "We're witnesses," said Harry. "You said hippogriffs attack if you insult them. It's Malfoy's problem he wasn't listening. We'll tell Dumbledore what really happened."
"You don't worry, Hagrid. We'll back you up,"
said Ron. Tears leaked out of the crinkled corners of Hagrid's beetle black eyes. He grabbed both Harry and Ron and pulled them into a bone-breaking hug.
I think you've had enough to drink, Hagrid,
said Hermione firmly. She took the tankard from the table and went outside to empty it.
Maybe she's right,
said Hagrid, letting go of Harry and Ron, who both staggered away, rubbing their ribs. Hagrid heaved himself out of his chair and followed Hermione unsteadily outside. They heard a loud splash. "What's he done?" said Harry nervously, as Hermione came back in with the empty tankard.
Stuck his head in the water barrel,
said Hermione, putting the tankard away. Hagrid came back, his long hair and beard sopping wet, wiping the water out of his eyes.
"That's better,"
he said, shaking his head like a dog and drenching them all.
"Listen, it was good of you to come and see me. I really..."
Hagrid stopped dead, staring at Harry as though he'd only just realized he was there.
"What do you think you're doing, eh?"
he roared, so suddenly that they jumped a foot in the air.
"You're not gonna go wandering around after dark, Harry? And you too, letting him..."
Hagrid strode over to Harry, grabbed his arm, and pulled him to the door.
"Come on,"
Hagrid said angrily.
"I'm taking you all back up to the school. And don't let me catch you walking down to see me after dark again. I'm not worth that."
Chapter 7. The Bogart in the Wardrobe. Malfoy didn't reappear in classes until late on Thursday morning, when the Slytherins and Gryffindors were halfway through double potions. He swaggered into the dungeon, his right arm covered in bandages, and bound up in a sling, acting, in Harry's opinion, as though he was the heroic survivor of some dreadful battle.
"How is it, Draco?"
simpered Pansy Parkinson.
"Does it hurt much?"
"Yeah," said Malfoy, putting on a brave sort of grimace. But Harry saw him wink at Crabbe and Goyle when Pansy had looked away. Settle down," said Professor Snape idly. Harry and Ron scowled at each other. Snape wouldn't have said settle down if they'd walked in late. He'd have given them detention. But Malfoy had always been able to get away with anything in Snape's classes. Snape was head of Slytherin House, and generally favored his own students before all others. They were making a new potion today, a shrinking solution. Malfoy set up his cauldron right next to Harry and Ron, so that they were preparing their ingredients on the same table.
"Sir,"
Malfoy called.
"Sir, I'll need help cutting these daisy roots because of my arm."
"Weasley, cut up Malfoy's roots for him," said Snape without looking up. Ron went brick red.
"There's nothing wrong with your arm,"
he hissed at Malfoy. Malfoy smirked across the table.
"Weasley, you heard Professor Snape. Cut up these roots."
Ron seized his knife, pulled Malfoy's roots towards him, and began to chop them roughly, so they were all different sizes.
"Professor,"
drawled Malfoy.
"Weasley's mutilating my roots, sir."
Snape approached their table, stared down his hooked nose at the roots, then gave Ron an unpleasant smile from beneath his long, greasy black hair. "Change roots with Malfoy, Weasley."
"But sir..."
Ron had spent the last quarter of an hour carefully shredding his own roots into exactly equal pieces. "Now," said Snape in his most dangerous voice. Ron shoved his own beautifully cut roots across the table at Malfoy, then took up a knife again.
"And sir, I'll need the shrivel fig skinned,"
said Malfoy, his voice full of malicious laughter. "Potter, you can skin Malfoy's shrivel fig," said Snape, giving Harry the look of loathing he always reserved just for him. Harry took Malfoy's shrivel fig, as Ron set about trying to repair the damage to the roots he now had to use. Harry skinned the shrivel fig as fast as he could and flung it back across the table at Malfoy, without speaking. Malfoy was smirking more broadly than ever.
"Seen your pal Hagrid today?"
he asked them quietly.
"None of your business,"
said Ron jerkily, without looking up.
"I'm afraid he won't be a teacher much longer,"
said Malfoy in a tone of mock sorrow.
"Father's not very happy about my injury."
"Keep talking, Malfoy, and I'll give you a real injury,"
snarled Ron.
"He's complained to the school governors and to the Ministry of Magic. Father's got a lot of influence, you know. And a lasting injury like this?"
He gave a huge fake sigh.
"Who knows if my arm will ever be the same again."
"So that's why you're putting it on," said Harry, accidentally beheading a caterpillar because his hand was shaking in anger. "To try and get Hagrid sacked?"
"Well,"
said Malfoy, lowering his voice to a whisper.
"Partly, Potter. But there are other benefits, too. Weasley, slice my caterpillars for me."
A few cauldrons away, Neville was in trouble. Neville regularly went to pieces in potions lessons. It was his worst subject, and his great fear of Professor Snape made things 10 times worse. His potion, which was supposed to be a bright acid green, had turned. "Orange Longbottom," said Snape, ladling some up and allowing it to splash back into the cauldron so that everyone could see. "Orange. Tell me, boy, does anything penetrate that thick skull of yours? Didn't you hear me say, quite clearly, that only one rat spleen was needed? Didn't I state plainly that a dash of leech juice would suffice? What do I have to do to make you understand, Longbottom?" Neville was pink and trembling. He looked as though he was on the verge of tears.
"Please, sir,"
said Hermione.
"Please, I could help Neville put it right."
"I don't remember asking you to show off, Miss Granger," said Snape coldly, and Hermione went as pink as Neville. "Longbottom, at the end of this lesson,
you will feed a few drops of this potion to your toad and see what happens. Perhaps that will encourage you to do it properly." Snape moved away, leaving Neville breathless with fear. "Help me," he moaned to Hermione. "Hey, Harry," said Seamus Finnegan, leaning over to borrow Harry's brass scales. "Have you heard? Daily Prophet this morning. The Dragon Sirius Black's been sighted." "Where?" said Harry and Ron quickly. On the other side of the table, Malfoy looked up, listening closely. "Not too far from here," said Seamus, who looked excited. "It was a muggle who saw him. Of course, she didn't really understand. The muggles think he's just an ordinary criminal, don't they? She phoned the telephone hotline. By the time the Ministry of Magic got there, he was gone." "Not too far from here?" Ron repeated, looking significantly at Harry. He turned around and saw Malfoy watching closely. "What, Malfoy? Need something else skinned?" But Malfoy's eyes were shining malevolently, and they were fixed on Harry. He leaned across the table.
Thinking of trying to catch Black single-handed, Potter?
"Yeah, that's right," said Harry offhandedly. Malfoy's thin mouth was curved into a mean smile.
"Of course, if it was me,"
he said quietly,
"I'd have done something before now. I wouldn't be staying in school like a good boy. I'd be out there looking for him."
"What are you talking about, Malfoy?" said Ron roughly.
"Don't you know, Potter?"
breathed Malfoy. His pale eyes narrowed. "Know what?" Malfoy let out a loud, sneering laugh.
"Maybe you'd rather not risk your neck," he said. "Want to leave it to the Dementors, do you? If it was me, I'd want revenge. I'd hunt him down myself."
"What are you talking about?" said Harry angrily. But at that moment, Snape called. "You should have finished adding your ingredients by now. This potion needs to stew before it can be drunk. Clear away while it simmers, and then we'll test Longbottoms." Crabbe and Goyle laughed openly, watching Neville sweat as he stirred his potion feverishly. Hermione was muttering instructions to him out of the corner of her mouth, so that Snape wouldn't see. Harry and Ron packed away their unused ingredients, and went to wash their hands and ladles in the stone basin in the corner. "What did Malfoy mean?" Harry muttered to Ron, as they stuck their hands under the icy jet that poured from a gargoyle's mouth. "Why would I want revenge on Black? He hasn't done anything to me. Yet." "He's making it up," said Ron savagely. "He's trying to make you do something stupid." The end of the lesson in sight, Snape strode over to Neville, who was cowering by his cauldron. "Everyone gather around," said Snape, his black eyes glittering, "and watch what happens to Longbottom's toad. If he has managed to produce a shrinking solution, it will shrink to a tadpole. If, as I don't doubt, he has done it wrong, his toad is likely to be poisoned." The Gryffindors watched fearfully. The Slytherins looked excited. Snape picked up Trevor the toad in his left hand and dipped a small spoon into Neville's potion, which was now green. He trickled a few drops down Trevor's throat. There was a moment of hushed silence, in which Trevor gulped. Then there was a small pop, and Trevor, the tadpole, was wriggling in Snape's palm. The Gryffindors burst into applause. Snape, looking sour, pulled a small bottle from the pocket of his robe, poured a few drops on top of Trevor, and he reappeared suddenly, fully grown. 5 points from Gryffindor," said Snape, which wiped the smiles from every face. "I told you not to help him, Miss Granger. Class dismissed." Harry, Ron, and Hermione climbed the steps to the entrance hall. Harry was still thinking about what Malfoy had said, while Ron was seething about Snape. 5 points from Gryffindor because the potion was all right? Why didn't you lie, Hermione? You should have said Neville did it all by himself. Hermione didn't answer. Ron looked around. Where is she? Harry turned, too. They were at the top of the steps now, watching the rest of the class pass them, heading for the Great Hall at lunch. She was right behind us, said Ron, frowning. Malfoy passed them, walking between Crabbe and Goyle. He smirked at Harry and disappeared. There she is, said Harry. Hermione was panting slightly, hurrying up the stairs. One hand clutching her bag, the other seemed to be tucking something down the front of her robes. How did you do that? said Ron.
What?
Said Hermione, joining them. 1 minute you were right behind us, and the next moment, you were back at the bottom of the stairs again.
What? Hermione looked slightly confused. Oh, I had to go back for something. Oh no!
A seam had split on Hermione's bag. Harry wasn't surprised. He could see that it was crammed with at least a dozen large and heavy books. Why are you carrying all these around with you? Ron asked her.
You know how many subjects I'm taking? Said Hermione breathlessly. Couldn't hold these for me, could you?
But... Ron was turning over the books she had handed him, looking at the covers. We haven't got any of these subjects today. It's only Defense Against the Dark Arts this afternoon.
Oh, yes,
said Hermione vaguely, but she packed all the books back into her bag, just the same.
I hope there's something good for lunch. I'm starving,
she added, and she marched off towards the Great Hall. Do you get the feeling Hermione's not telling us something? Ron asked Harry. Professor Lupin wasn't there when they arrived at his first Defense Against the Dark Arts lesson. They all sat down, took out their books, quills, and parchment, and were talking when he finally entered the room. Lupin smiled vaguely, and placed his tatty old briefcase on the teacher's desk. He was as shabby as ever, but looked healthier than he had on the train, as though he had had a few square meals. Good afternoon, he said. Would you please put all your books back in your bags? Today's will be a practical lesson. You will only need your wands. A few curious looks were exchanged as the class put away their books. They had never had a practical Defense Against the Dark Arts before, unless you counted the memorable class last year, when their old teacher had brought a cage full of pixies to class and set them loose. Right then, said Professor Lupin, when everyone was ready. If you'd follow me. Puzzled but interested, the class got to its feet and followed Professor Lupin out of the classroom. He led them along the deserted corridor and around a corner, where the first thing they saw was Peeves the Poltergeist, who was floating upside down in midair and stuffing the nearest keyhole with chewing gum. Peeves didn't look up until Professor Lupin was 2 feet away. Then he wiggled his curly-toed feet and broke into song. Loony loopy Lupin, Peeves sang. Loony loopy Lupin, loony loopy Lupin. Rude and unmanageable as he almost always was, Peeves usually showed some respect towards the teachers. Everyone looked quickly at Professor Lupin to see how he would take this. To their surprise, he was still smiling. I'd take that gum out of the keyhole if I were you, Peeves, he said pleasantly. Mr. Filch won't be able to get into his brooms. Filch was the Hogwarts caretaker, a bad-tempered, failed wizard who waged a constant war against the students and, indeed, Peeves. However, Peeves paid no attention to Professor Lupin's words, except to blow a loud, wet raspberry. Professor Lupin gave a small sigh and took out his wand. This is a very useful little spell, he told the class over his shoulder. Please watch closely. He raised the wand to shoulder height, said, Wadawashi, and pointed at Peeves. With the force of a bullet, the wad of chewing gum shot out of the keyhole and straight down Peeves' left nostril. He whirled right up and zoomed away, cursing. Cool, sir, said Dean Thomas in amazement. Thank you, Dean, said Professor Lupin, putting his wand away again. Shall we proceed? They set off again, the class looking at shabby Professor Lupin with increased respect. He led them down a second corridor and stopped, right outside the staff room door. Inside, please, said Professor Lupin, opening it and standing back. The staff room, a long paneled room full of old mismatched chairs, was empty except for one teacher. Professor Snape was sitting in a low armchair, and he looked around as the class filed in. His eyes were glittering, and there was a nasty sneer playing around his mouth. As Professor Lupin came in and made to close the door behind him, Snape said, Leave it open, Lupin. I'd rather not witness this. He got to his feet and strode past the class, his black robes billowing behind him. At the doorway, he turned on his heel and said, Possibly no one's warned you, Lupin, but this class contains Neville Longbottom. I will advise you not to entrust him with anything difficult. Not unless Miss Granger is hissing instructions in his ear. Neville went scarlet. Harry glared at Snape. It was bad enough that he bullied Neville in his own classes, let alone doing it in front of other teachers. Professor Lupin had raised his eyebrows. "I was hoping that Neville would assist me with the first stage of the operation," he said, "and I am sure he will perform it admirably." Neville's face went, if possible, even redder. Snape's lips curled, but he left, shutting the door with a snap. "Now then," said Professor Lupin, beckoning the class towards the end of the room, where there was nothing except an old wardrobe in which the teachers kept their spare robes. As Professor Lupin went to stand next to it, the wardrobe gave a sudden wobble, banging off the wall. "Nothing to worry about," said Professor Lupin calmly, as a few people jumped backwards in alarm. "There's a Bogart in there." Most people seemed to feel that this was something to worry about. Neville gave Professor Lupin a look of pure terror, and Seamus Finnegan eyed the now rattling doorknob apprehensively. "Bogarts like dark, enclosed spaces," said Professor Lupin. "Wardrobes, the gap beneath beds, the cupboards under the sink. I once met one that had lodged itself in a grandfather clock. This one moved in yesterday afternoon, and I asked the headmaster if the staff would leave it to give my third years some practice. So, the first question we must ask ourselves is, what is a Bogart?" Hermione put up her hand.
"It's a shapeshifter," she said. "It can take the shape of whatever it thinks will frighten us most."
"Couldn't have put it better myself," said Professor Lupin, and Hermione glowed. "So, the Bogart sitting in the darkness within has not yet assumed a form. He does not yet know what will frighten the person on the other side of the door. Nobody knows what a Bogart looks like when they're alone, but when I let it out, it will immediately become whatever each of us fears most. This means," said Professor Lupin, choosing to ignore Neville's small splutter of terror, "that we have a huge advantage over the Bogart before we begin. Have you spotted it, Harry?" Trying to answer a question with Hermione next to him, bobbing up and down on the balls of her feet, with her hand in the air, was very off-putting, but Harry had to go. Because there are so many of us, it won't know what shape it should be?" "Precisely," said Professor Lupin, and Hermione put her hand down, looking a little disappointed. "It's always best to have company when you're dealing with a Bogart. It becomes confused. Which should they become, a headless corpse or a flesh-eating slug? I once saw a Bogart make that very mistake, tried to frighten two people at once, and turned himself into a half-slug. Not remotely frightening. The charm that repels a Bogart is simple, yet it requires force of mind. You see, the thing that really finishes a Bogart is laughter. What you need to do is force it to assume a shape that you find amusing. We will practice the charm without wands first. After me, please. Ridiculous! Ridiculous! Said the class together. Good, said Professor Lupin. Very good. But that was the easy part, I'm afraid. You see, the word alone is not enough, and this is where you come in, Neville. The wardrobe shook again, though not as much as Neville, who walked forward as though he was heading for the gallows. Right, Neville, said Professor Lupin. First things first. What would you say is the thing that frightens you the most in the world? Neville's lips moved, but no noise came out. Didn't catch that, Neville, sorry, said Professor Lupin cheerfully. Neville looked around rather wildly, as though begging someone to help him, then said, in barely more than a whisper, Professor Snape. Nearly everyone laughed. Even Neville grinned apologetically. Professor Lupin, however, looked thoughtful. Professor Snape. Neville, I believe you live with your grandmother? Yeah, said Neville nervously. But I don't want the Bogart to turn into her either. No, you misunderstand me, said Professor Lupin, now smiling. I wonder, could you tell us what sort of clothes your grandmother usually wears? Neville looked startled, but said, Well, always the same hat, a tall one with a stuffed vulture on top, and a long dress, green normally, and sometimes a fox fur scarf. And a handbag? Prompted Professor Lupin. A big red one. Right then, said Professor Lupin. Can you picture those clothes very clearly, Neville? Can you see them in your mind's eye? Yes? Said Neville uncertainly, plainly wondering what was coming next. When the Bogart bursts out of this wardrobe, Neville, and sees you, it will assume the form of Professor Snape, said Lupin, and you will raise your wand, thus, and cry ridiculous, and concentrate hard on your grandmother's clothes. If all goes well, Professor Bogart Snape will be forced into the vulture-topped hat, the green dress, that big red handbag. There was a great shout of laughter. The wardrobe wobbled more violently. If Neville is successful, the Bogart is likely to turn his attention to each of us in turn, said Professor Lupin. I would like all of you to take a moment now to think of the thing that scares you the most, and imagine how you might force it to look comical. The room went quiet. Harry thought, what scared him most in the world? His first thought was Lord Voldemort. A Voldemort returned to full strength. But before he'd even started to plan a possible counterattack on a Bogart Voldemort, a horrible image came floating to the surface of his mind. A rotting, glistening hand, slithering back beneath a black cloak. A long, rattling breath from an unseen mouth. Then a cold so penetrating it felt like drowning. Harry shivered, then looked around, hoping no one had noticed. Many people had their eyes shut tight. Ron was muttering to himself, "Take its legs off." Harry was sure he knew what that was about. Ron's greatest fear was spiders. "Everyone ready?" said Professor Lupin. Harry felt a lurch of fear. He wasn't ready. How could you make a Dementor less frightening? But he didn't want to ask for more time. Everyone else was nodding and rolling up their sleeves. "Neville, we're going to back away," said Professor Lupin. "Let you have a clear field, all right? I'll call the next person forward. Everyone back now, so Neville can get a good clear shot." They all retreated, backing against the walls, leaving Neville alone beside the wardrobe. He looked pale and frightened, but he had pushed up the sleeves of his robes and was holding his wand ready. "On the count of 3, Neville," said Professor Lupin, who was pointing his own wand at the handle of the wardrobe. 1, 2, 3, now! A jet of sparks shot from the end of Professor Lupin's wand and hit the doorknob. The wardrobe burst open. Hook-nosed and menacing, Professor Snape stepped out, his eyes flashing at Neville. Neville backed away, his wand up, mouthing wordlessly. Snape was bearing down upon him, reaching inside his robes. "Ridiculous!" squealed Neville. There was a noise like a whip crack. Snape stumbled. He was wearing a long, lace-trimmed dress and a towering hat topped with a moth-eaten vulture, and swinging a huge crimson handbag from his hand. There was a roar of laughter. The Bogart paused, confused, and Professor Lupin shouted, "Parvati, forward!" Parvati walked forward, her face set. Snape rounded on her. There was another crack, and where he stood was a blood-stained, bandaged mummy. Its sightless face was turned to Parvati, and it began to walk towards her, very slowly, dragging its feet, its arms still rising. "Ridiculous!" cried Parvati. A bandage unraveled at the mummy's feet. It became entangled, fell face forward, and its head rolled off. "Seamus!" roared Professor Lupin. Seamus darted past Parvati. Crack! Where the mummy had been was a woman with floor-length black hair and a skeletal, green-tinged face. A banshee. She opened her mouth wide, and an unearthly sound filled the room. A long, wailing shriek, which made the hair on Harry's head stand on end. "Ridiculous!" shouted Seamus. The banshee made a rasping noise and clutched her throat. Her voice was gone. Crack! The banshee turned into a rat, which chased its tail in a circle. Then, crack! Became a rattlesnake, which slithered and withered before, crack! Becoming a single bloody eyeball. "It's confused!" shouted Lupin. "We're getting there! Dean!" Dean hurried forward. Crack! The eyeball became a severed hand, which flipped over and began to creep along the floor like a crab. "Ridiculous!" yelled Dean. There was a snap, and the hand was trapped in a mousetrap. "Excellent! Ron, you next!" Ron leapt forward. Crack! Quite a few people screamed. A gigantic spider, 6 feet tall and covered in hair, was advancing on Ron, clicking its pincers menacingly. For a moment, Harry thought Ron had frozen. Then, "Ridiculous!" bellowed Ron, and the spider's legs vanished. It rolled over and over. Lavender Brown squealed and ran out of its way, and it came to a halt at Harry's feet. He raised his wand ready, but... "Here!" shouted Professor Lupin suddenly, hurrying forward. Crack! The legless spider had vanished. For a second, everyone looked wildly around to see where it was. Then they saw a silvery white orb hanging in the air in front of Lupin, who said, "Ridiculous!" almost lazily. Crack! "Forward, Neville, and finish him off," said Lupin, as the Bogart landed on the floor as a cockroach. Crack! Snape was back. This time Neville charged forward, looking determined. "Ridiculous!" he shouted, and they had a split-second's view of Snape in a lacy dress before Neville let out a huge, great "ha!" of laughter, and the Bogart exploded, burst into 1,000 tiny wisps of smoke, and was gone. "Excellent!" cried Professor Lupin, as the class broke into applause. "Excellent, Neville. Well done, everyone. Let me see. 5 points to Gryffindor for every person to tackle the Bogart. 10 for Neville, because he did it twice. And 5 each to Hermione and Harry." "But I didn't do anything," said Harry. "You and Hermione answered my questions correctly at the start of the class, Harry," Lupin said lightly. "Very well, everyone. An excellent lesson. Homework. Kindly read the chapter on Bogarts and summarize it for me. To be handed in on Monday. That will be all." Talking excitedly, the class left the staff room. Harry, however, wasn't feeling cheerful. Professor Lupin had deliberately stopped him tackling the Bogart. Why? Was it because he'd seen Harry collapse on the train, and thought he wasn't up to much? Had he thought Harry would pass out again? But no one else seemed to have noticed anything. "Did you see me take that banshee?" shouted Seamus. "And the hand?" said Dean, waving his own around. "And Snape in that hat?" "And my mummy? I wonder why Professor Lupin's frightened of crystal balls," said Lavender thoughtfully. "That was the best defense against the dark arts lesson we've ever had, wasn't it?" said Ron excitedly, as they made their way back to the classroom to get their bags.
"He seems a very good teacher," said Hermione approvingly. "But I wish I could have had a turn with the Bogart."
"What would it have been for you?" said Ron, sniggering. "A piece of homework that only got 9 out of 10?
Chapter 8. Flight of the Fat Lady. In no time at all, Defense Against the Dark Arts had become most people's favorite class. Only Draco Malfoy and his gang of Slytherins had anything bad to say about Professor Lupin. "Look at the state of his robes," Malfoy would say in a loud whisper as Professor Lupin passed. "He dresses like our old house elf." But no one else cared that Professor Lupin's robes were patched and frayed. His next few lessons were just as interesting as the first. After Bogarts, they studied redcaps, nasty goblin-like little creatures that lurked wherever there had been bloodshed, in the dungeons of castles and the potholes of deserted battlefields, waiting to bludgeon those who'd gotten lost. From redcaps they moved to kappas, creepy water dwellers that looked like scaly monkeys, with webbed hands itching to strangle unwitting waders in the ponds. Harry only wished he was as happy with some of his other classes. Worst of all was potions. Snape was in a particularly vindictive mood these days, and no one was in any doubt why. The story of the Bogart assuming Snape's shape, and the way that Neville dressed it in his grandmother's clothes, had traveled through the school like wildfire. Snape didn't seem to find it funny. His eyes flashed menacingly at the very mention of Professor Lupin's name, and he was bullying Neville worse than ever. Harry was also growing to dread the hours he spent in Professor Trelawney's stifling tower room, deciphering lopsided shapes and symbols, trying to ignore the way Professor Trelawney's enormous eyes filled with tears every time she looked at him. He couldn't like Professor Trelawney, even though she was treated with respect, bordering on reverence, by many of the class. Parvati Patil and Lavender Brown had taken to haunting Professor Trelawney's tower room at lunchtimes, and always returned with annoyingly superior looks on their faces, as though they knew things the others didn't. They'd also started using hushed voices whenever they spoke to Harry, as though he was on his deathbed. Nobody really liked care of magical creatures, which, after the action-packed first class, had become extremely dull. Hagrid seemed to have lost his confidence. They were now spending lesson after lesson learning how to look after flobberworms, which had to be some of the most boring creatures in existence.
Why would anyone bother looking after them?
Said Ron, after yet another hour of poking shredded lettuce down the flobberworms' slimy throats. At the start of October, however, Harry had something else to occupy him. Something so enjoyable it made up for his unsatisfactory classes. The Quidditch season was approaching, and Oliver Wood, captain of the Gryffindor team, called a meeting one Thursday evening to discuss tactics for the new season. There were 7 people on a Quidditch team, 3 chasers, whose job it was to score goals by putting the quaffle, a red football-sized ball, through one of the 50-foot-high hoops at each end of the pitch. 2 beaters, who were equipped with heavy bats to repel the bludgers. 2 heavy black balls, which zoomed around, trying to attack the players. A keeper, who defended the goalposts, and the seeker, who had the hardest job of all, that of catching the golden snitch, a tiny, winged, walnut-sized ball, whose capture ended the game and earned the seeker's team an extra 150 points. Oliver Wood was a burly 17-year-old, now in his 7th and final year at Hogwarts. There was a quiet sort of desperation in his voice as he addressed his 6 fellow team members in the chilly changing rooms on the edge of the darkening Quidditch pitch.
This is our last chance, my last chance, to win the Quidditch Cup,
he told them, striding up and down in front of them.
I'll be leaving at the end of this year. I'll never get another shot at it. Gryffindor haven't won for 7 years now. Okay, so we've had the worst luck in the world. Injuries, then the tournament getting called off last year.
Wood swallowed, as though the memory brought a lump to his throat.
But we also know we've got the best ratty team in the school,
he said, punching a fist into his other hand, the old manic glint back in his eye.
We've got 3 superb chasers.
Wood pointed at Alicia Spinnet, Angelina Johnson, and Katie Bell.
We've got 2 unbeatable beaters.
Stop it, Oliver, you're embarrassing us, said Fred and George Weasley, together, pretending to blush.
And we've got a seeker who's never failed to win us a match.
Losing one's way.
Wood rumbled, glaring at Harry with a kind of furious pride.
And me,
he added, as an afterthought.
We think you're very good too, Oliver,
said George.
Cracking keeper,
said Fred.
The point is,
Wood went on, resuming his pacing,
the Quidditch Cup should have had our name on
Never
it
forget
in these last
who
2
you are.
years, ever since Harry joined the team. I thought the thing was in the bag, but we haven't got it. And this year is the last chance we'll get to finally set our name on the thing.
Wood spoke so dejectedly that Fred and George looked sympathetic.
Oliver, this year's our year,
said Fred.
We'll do it, Oliver,
said Angelina. Definitely, said Harry. Full of determination, the team started training sessions, 3 evenings a week. The weather was getting colder and wetter, the nights darker, but no amount of mud, wind, or rain could tarnish Harry's wonderful vision of finally winning the huge silver Quidditch Cup. Harry returned to the Gryffindor common room one evening after training, cold and stiff, but pleased with the way the practice had gone, to find the room buzzing excitedly. "What's happened?" he asked Ron and Hermione, who were sitting in 2 of the best chairs by the fireside and completing some star charts for astronomy.
First Hogsmeade weekend,
said Ron, pointing at a notice that had appeared on the battered old notice board.
End of October, Halloween. Excellent,
said Fred, who had followed Harry through the portrait hole.
I need to visit Zonko's. I'm nearly out of stink pellets.
Harry threw himself into a chair beside Ron, his high spirits ebbing away. Hermione seemed to read his mind.
Harry, I'm sure you'll be able to go next time,
she said.
They're bound to catch Black soon. He's been sighted once already.
Black's not fool enough to try anything in Hogsmeade, said Ron. Ask McGonagall if you can go this time, Harry. The next one might not be for ages.
Ron,
said Hermione.
Harry's supposed to stay at school.
He can't be the only third year left behind,
said Ron.
Ask McGonagall. Go on, Harry.
Yeah, I think I will, said Harry, making up his mind. Hermione opened her mouth to argue, but at that moment Crookshanks leapt lightly onto her lap. A large, dead spider was dangling from his mouth.
Does he have to eat that in front of us?
Said Ron, scowling.
Clever, Crookshanks. Did you catch that all by yourself?
Said Hermione. Crookshanks slowly chewed up the spider, his yellow eyes fixed instantly on Ron.
Just keep him over there, that's all,
said Ron irritably, turning back to his star chart.
I've got Scabbers asleep in my bag.
Harry yawned. He really wanted to go to bed, but he still had his own star chart to complete. He pulled his bag towards him, took out parchment, ink, and a quill, and started work.
You can copy mine if you like,
said Ron, labeling his last star with a flourish, and shoving the chart towards Harry. Hermione, who disapproved of copying, pursed her lips, but didn't say anything. Crookshanks was still staring unblinkingly at Ron, flicking the end of his bushy tail. Then, without warning, he pounced.
Oi!
Ron roared, seizing his bag, as Crookshanks sank 4 sets of claws deeply into it, and began tearing ferociously.
Get off, you stupid animal!
Ron tried to pull the bag away from Crookshanks, but Crookshanks clung on, spitting and slashing.
Ron, don't hurt him!
Squealed Hermione. The whole common room was watching. Ron whirled the bag around, Crookshanks still clinging to it, and Scabbers came flying out of the top.
Catch that cat!
Ron yelled, as Crookshanks freed himself from the remnants of the bag, sprang over the table, and chased after the terrified Scabbers. George Weasley made a lunge for Crookshanks, but missed. Scabbers streaked through 20 pairs of legs and shot beneath an old chest of drawers. Crookshanks skidded to a halt, crouched low on his bandy legs, and started making furious swipes beneath the chest of drawers with his front paw. Ron and Hermione hurried over. Hermione grabbed Crookshanks around the middle and heaved him away. Ron threw himself onto his stomach and, with great difficulty, pulled Scabbers out by the tail.
Look at him,
he said furiously to Hermione, dangling Scabbers in front of her.
He's skin and bone. You keep that cat away from him.
Crookshanks doesn't understand, it's wrong,
said Hermione, her voice shaking.
All cats chase rats, Ron.
There's something funny about that animal,
said Ron, who was trying to persuade a frantically wiggling Scabbers back into his pocket.
It heard me say that Scabbers was in my bag.
Oh, what rubbish,
said Hermione impatiently.
Crookshanks could smell him, Ron. How else do you think?
That cat's got it in for Scabbers,
said Ron, ignoring the people around him, who were starting to giggle.
And Scabbers was here first, and he's ill.
Ron marched through the common room and out of sight up the stairs to the boys' dormitories. Ron was still in a bad mood with Hermione next day. He barely talked to her all through herbology, even though he, Harry, and Hermione were working together on the same puffapod.
How's Scabbers?
Hermione asked timidly, as they stripped fat pink pods from the plants and emptied the shining beans into a wooden pail.
He's hiding at the bottom of my bed, shaking,
said Ron angrily, missing the pail and scattering beans over the greenhouse floor. Careful, Weasley, careful, cried Professor Sprout, as the beans burst into bloom before their very eyes. They had Transfiguration next. Harry, who had resolved to ask Professor McGonagall after the lesson whether he could go into Hogsmeade with the rest, joined the queue outside the classroom, trying to decide how he was going to argue his case. He was distracted, however, by a disturbance at the front of the line. Lavender Brown seemed to be crying. Parvati had her arm around her, and was explaining something to Seamus Finnegan and Dean Thomas, who were looking very serious.
What's the matter, Lavender?
Said Hermione anxiously, as she, Harry, and Ron went to join the group. She got a letter from home this morning, Parvati whispered. It's her rabbit, Binky. He's been killed by a fox.
Oh,
said Hermione.
I'm sorry, Lavender.
I should have known, said Lavender tragically. You know what day it is? The 16th of October. That thing you're dreading, it will happen on the 16th of October, remember? She was right, she was right. The whole class was gathered around Lavender now.
Seamus shook his head seriously. Hermione hesitated. Then she said,
You were dreading Binky being killed by a fox?
Well, not necessarily by a fox, said Lavender, looking up at Hermione with streaming eyes. But I was obviously dreading him dying, wasn't I?
Oh,
said Hermione. She paused again. Then,
was Binky an old rabbit?
No, sobbed Lavender. He was only a baby. Parvati tightened her arm around Lavender's shoulders.
But then, why would you dread him dying?
Said Hermione. Parvati glared at her.
Well, look at it logically,
said Hermione, turning to the rest of the group.
I mean, Binky didn't even die today, did he? Lavender just got the news today.
Lavender wailed loudly.
And she can't have been dreading it, because it's come as a real shock.
Don't mind Hermione, Lavender, said Ron loudly. She doesn't think other people's pets matter very much.
Professor McGonagall opened the classroom door at that moment, which was perhaps lucky. Hermione and Ron were looking daggers at each other, and when they got into class, they seated themselves either side of Harry, and didn't talk to each other all lesson. Harry still hadn't decided what he was going to say to Professor McGonagall when the bell rang at the end of the lesson. But it was she who brought up the subject of Hogsmeade first. "One moment, please," she called as the class made to leave. "As you're all in my house, you should hand Hogsmeade permission forms to me before Halloween. No form, no visiting the village. So don't forget." Neville put up his hand. "Please, Professor, I think I've lost." "Your grandmother sent yours to me directly, Longbottom," said Professor McGonagall. "She seemed to think it was safer. Well, that's all. You may leave."
"Ask her now,"
Ron hissed at Harry.
"Oh, but..."
Hermione began.
"Go for it, Harry,"
said Ron stubbornly. Harry waited for the rest of the class to disappear, then headed nervously for Professor McGonagall's desk. "Yes, Potter?" Harry took a deep breath. "Professor, my aunt and uncle, forgot to sign my form," he said. Professor McGonagall looked over her square spectacles at him, but didn't say anything. "So, do you think it would be alright? I mean, will it be okay if I go to Hogsmeade?" Professor McGonagall looked down and began shuffling papers on her desk. "I'm afraid not, Potter," she said. "You heard what I said. No form, no visiting the village. That's the rule." "But, Professor, my aunt and uncle, you know they're muggles. They don't really understand about Hogwarts forms and stuff," Harry said, while Ron egged him on with vigorous nods. "If you said I could go..." "But I don't say so," said Professor McGonagall, standing up and piling her papers neatly into a drawer. "The form clearly states that a parent or guardian must give permission." She turned to look at him, with an odd expression on her face. Was it pity? "I'm sorry, Potter, but that's my final word. You better hurry, or you'll be late for your next lesson." There was nothing to be done. Ron called Professor McGonagall a lot of names that greatly annoyed Hermione. Hermione assumed an all-for-the-best expression that made Ron even angrier, and Harry had to endure everyone in the class talking loudly and happily about what they were going to do first once they got into Hogsmeade.
"There's always the feast,"
said Ron in an effort to cheer Harry up.
"You know, the Halloween feast in the evening."
"Yeah," said Harry gloomily. "Great." The Halloween feast was always good, but it would taste a lot better if he was coming to it after a day in Hogsmeade with everyone else. Nothing anyone said made him feel any better about being left behind. Dean Thomas, who was good with the quill, had offered to forge Uncle Vernon's signature on a form, but as Harry had already told Professor McGonagall he hadn't had it signed, it was no good. Ron half-heartedly suggested the invisibility cloak, but Hermione stamped on that one, reminding Ron what Dumbledore had told them about the Dementors being able to see through them. Percy had what were possibly the least helpful words of comfort. "They make a fuss about Hogsmeade, but I assure you, Harry, it's not all it's cracked up to be," he said seriously. "All right, the sweet shop's rather good, but Zonko's joke shop's frankly dangerous. And yes, the Shrieking Shack's always worth a visit, but really, Harry,
Apart from that, you're not missing anything. On Halloween morning, Harry awoke with the rest and went down to breakfast, feeling thoroughly depressed, though doing his best to act normally.
We'll bring you lots of sweets back from Honeydukes,
said Hermione, looking desperately sorry for him.
Yeah, loads,
said Ron. He and Hermione had finally forgotten their squabble about Crookshanks in the face of Harry's disappointment. Don't worry about me, said Harry, in what he hoped was an offhand voice. I'll see you at the feast. Have a good time. He accompanied them to the entrance hall, where Filch, the caretaker, was standing inside the front doors, checking off names against a long list, peering suspiciously into every face, and making sure that no one was sneaking out who shouldn't be going.
"Staying here, Potter?"
shouted Malfoy, who was standing in line with Crabbe and Goyle.
"Scared of passing the Dementors?"
Harry ignored him, and made his solitary way up the marble staircase, through the deserted corridors, and back to Gryffindor Tower. "Password," said the fat lady, jerking out of a doze. "Fortuna Major," said Harry listlessly. The portrait swung open, and he climbed through the hole into the common room. It was full of chattering first and second years, and a few older students who would obviously visit Hogsmeade so often the novelty had worn off. "Harry! Harry! Hi, Harry!" It was Colin Creevey, a second year who was deeply in awe of Harry and never missed an opportunity to speak to him. "Aren't you going to Hogsmeade, Harry?" "Why not? Hey!" Colin looked eagerly around at his friends. "You can come and sit with us if you like, Harry." No thanks, Colin," said Harry, who wasn't in the mood to have a lot of people staring avidly at the scar on his forehead. I've got to go to the library. Gotta get some work done." After that, he had no choice but to turn right around and head back out of the portrait hole again. "What was the point of waking me up?" the fat lady called grumpily after him, as he walked away. Harry wandered, dispiritedly, towards the library. But halfway there he changed his mind. He didn't feel like working. He turned around and came face to face with Filch, who had obviously just seen off the last of the Hogsmeade visitors. "What are you doing?" Filch snarled suspiciously. "Nothing," said Harry truthfully. "Nothing," spat Filch, his jowls quivering unpleasantly. "A likely story. Sneaking around on your own. Why aren't you in Hogsmeade buying stink pellets and belch powder? And wheezing worms like the rest of your nasty little friends?" Harry shrugged. "Well, get back to your common room where you belong," snapped Filch, and he stood, glaring, until Harry had passed out of sight. But Harry didn't go back to the common room. He climbed a staircase, thinking vaguely of visiting the owlery to see Hedwig, and was walking along another corridor when a voice from inside one of the rooms said, "Harry." Harry doubled back to see who had spoken, and met Professor Lupin, looking around his office door. "What are you doing?" said Lupin, in a very different voice from Filch. "Where are Ron and Hermione?" "Hogsmeade," said Harry, in a would-be casual voice. "Ah," said Lupin. He considered Harry for a moment. "Why don't you come in? I've just taken delivery of a Grindylow for our next lesson." "A what?" said Harry. He followed Lupin into his office. In the corner stood a very large tank of water. A sickly green creature with sharp little horns had its face pressed against the glass, pulling faces and flexing its long, spindly fingers. "Water demons," said Lupin, surveying the Grindylow thoughtfully. "We shouldn't have much difficulty with them. Not after the Kappas. The trick is to break his grip. You notice the abnormally long fingers? Strong, but very brittle." The Grindylow bared its green teeth, and then buried itself in a tangle of weed in the corner. "Cup of tea?" Lupin said, looking around for his kettle. "I was just thinking of making one." "All right," said Harry awkwardly. Lupin tapped the kettle with his wand, and a blast of steam issued suddenly from the spout. "Sit down," said Lupin, taking the lid off a dusty tin. "I've only got tea bags, I'm afraid, but I dare say you've had enough of tea leaves." Harry looked at him. Lupin's eyes were twinkling. "How did you know about that?" Harry asked. "Professor McGonagall told me," said Lupin, passing Harry a chipped mug of tea. "You're not worried, are you?" "No," said Harry. He thought for a moment of telling Lupin about the dog he'd seen in Magnolia Crescent, but decided not to. He didn't want Lupin to think he was a coward, especially since Lupin already seemed to think he couldn't cope with a Bogart. Something of Harry's thoughts seemed to have shone on his face, because Lupin said, "Anything worrying you, Harry?" "No," Harry lied. He drank a bit of tea and watched the Grindylows brandishing a fist at him. "Yes," he said suddenly, putting his tea down on Lupin's desk. "You know that day we fought the Bogart?" "Yes," said Lupin slowly. "Why didn't you let me fight it?" said Harry abruptly. Lupin raised his eyebrows. "I would have thought that was obvious, Harry," he said, sounding surprised. Harry, who had expected Lupin to deny that he'd done any such thing, was taken aback. "Why?" he said again. "Well," said Lupin, frowning slightly, "I assumed that if the Bogart faced you, it would assume the shape of Lord Voldemort." Harry stared. Not only was this the last answer he'd expected, but Lupin had said Voldemort's name. The only person Harry had ever heard say the name aloud, apart from himself, was Professor Dumbledore. "Clearly I was wrong," said Lupin, still frowning at Harry. "But I didn't think it a good idea for Lord Voldemort to materialize in the staff room. I imagined that people would panic." "I did think of Voldemort first," said Harry honestly. "But then I remembered those Dementors." "I see," said Lupin thoughtfully. Well, I'm impressed." He smiled slightly at the look of surprise on Harry's face. "That suggests that what you fear most of all is fear. Very wise, Harry." Harry didn't know what to say to this, so he drank some more tea. "So you've been thinking that I didn't believe you capable of fighting the Bogart?" said Lupin shrewdly. "Well, yeah," said Harry. He was suddenly feeling a lot happier. "Professor Lupin, you know the Dementors?" He was interrupted by a knock on the door. "Come in," called Lupin. The door opened, and in came Snape. He was carrying a goblet which was smoking faintly, and stopped at the sight of Harry, his black eyes narrowing. "Ah, Severus," said Lupin, smiling. "Thanks very much. Could you leave it here on the desk for me?" Snape set the smoking goblet down, his eyes wandering between Harry and Lupin. "I was just showing Harry my Grindylow," said Lupin pleasantly, pointing at the tank. "Fascinating," said Snape without looking at it. "You should drink that directly, Lupin." Yes, I will," said Lupin. "I made an entire cauldron full," Snape continued, "if you need more. I should probably take some again tomorrow. Thanks very much, Severus." "Not at all," said Snape. There was a look in his eye Harry didn't like. He backed out of the room, unsmiling and watchful. Harry looked curiously at the goblet. Lupin smiled. "Professor Snape has very kindly concocted a potion for me," he said. "I've never been much of a potion brewer, and this one is particularly complex." He picked up the goblet and sniffed it. "Pity sugar makes it useless," he added, taking a sip and shuddering. "Why—" Harry began. Lupin looked at him and answered the unfinished question. "I've been feeling a bit off-color," he said. "This potion is the only thing that helps. I'm very lucky to be working alongside Professor Snape. There aren't many wizards who are up to making it." Professor Lupin took another sip, and Harry had a mad urge to knock the goblet out of his hands. "Professor Snape's very interested in the dark arts," he blurted out. "Really?" said Lupin, looking only mildly interested as he took another gulp of potion. "Some people reckon—" Harry hesitated, then plunged recklessly on. "Some people reckon he'd do anything to get the Defense Against the Dark Arts job." Lupin drained the goblet and pulled a face. "Disgusting," he said. "Well, Harry, I'd better get back to work. I'll see you at the feast later." "Right," said Harry, putting his empty teacup down. The empty goblet was still smoking. "There you go," said Ron. "We got as much as we could carry." A shower of brilliantly colored sweets fell into Harry's lap. It was dusk, and Ron and Hermione had just turned up in the common room, pink-faced from the cold wind, and looking as though they'd had the time of their lives. "Thanks," said Harry, picking up a packet of tiny black peppermints. "What's Hogsmeade like? Where did you guys go?" By the sound of it, everywhere.
Dervish and Bangs, the Wizarding Equipment Shop, Zonko's Joke Shop, and to the 3 broomsticks for foaming mugs of hot butterbeer, and many places besides.
The post office, Harry. About 200 owls, all sitting on shelves, all color-coded, depending on how fast you want your letter to get there.
Honeydukes have got a new kind of fudge. They were giving out free samples. There's a bit, look.
We think we saw an ogre. Honestly, we had all sorts of the 3 broomsticks.
Wish we could have brought you some butterbeer. Really warms you up.
What did you do?
Said Hermione, looking anxious.
Did you get any work done?
No, said Harry. Lupin made me a cup of tea in his office, and then Snape came in. He told them all about the goblet. Ron's mouth fell open.
Lupin drank it?
He gasped.
Is he mad?
Hermione checked her watch. We better go down, you know. The feast will be starting in 5 minutes. They hurried through the portrait hole and into the crowd, still discussing Snape.
But if he, you know...
Hermione dropped her voice, glancing nervously around.
If he was trying to poison Lupin, he wouldn't have done it in front of Harry.
Yeah, maybe, said Harry, as they reached the entrance hall, and crossed into the Great Hall. It had been decorated with hundreds and hundreds of candle-filled pumpkins, a cloud of fluttering live bats, and many flaming orange streamers, which were swimming lazily across the stormy ceiling like brilliant water snakes. The food was delicious. Even Hermione and Ron, who were full to bursting with Honeydukes sweets, managed second helpings of everything. Harry kept glancing at the staff table. Professor Lupin looked cheerful, and as well as he ever did. He was talking animatedly to tiny little Professor Flitwick, the charms teacher. Harry moved his eyes along the table, to the place where Snape sat. Was he imagining it, or were Snape's eyes flickering towards Lupin more often than was natural? The feast finished with an entertainment provided by the Hogwarts ghosts. They popped out of the walls and tables to do a spot of formation gliding. Nearly Headless Nick, the Gryffindor ghost, had a great success with a reenactment of his own Bosch beheading. It had been such a good evening that Harry's good mood couldn't even be spoiled by Malfoy, who shouted through the crowd as they all left the hall.
The Dementors send their love, Potter.
Harry, Ron, and Hermione followed the rest of the Gryffindors along the usual path to Gryffindor Tower. But when they reached the corridor which ended with the portrait of the fat lady, they found it jammed with students.
Why isn't anyone going in?
Said Ron curiously. Harry peered over the heads in front of them. The portrait seemed to be closed. "Let me through, please," came Percy's voice, and he came bustling importantly through the crowd. "What's the hold-up here? You can't all have forgotten the password. Excuse me, I'm head boy." And then a silence fell over the crowd, from the front first, so that a chill seemed to spread down the corridor. They heard Percy say, in a suddenly sharp voice, "Somebody get Professor Dumbledore, quick!" People's heads turned. Those at the back were standing on tiptoe.
"What's going on?"
said Ginny, who had just arrived. Next moment, Professor Dumbledore was there, sweeping towards the portrait. The Gryffindors squeezed together to let him through. And Harry, Ron, and Hermione moved closer to see what the trouble was.
"Oh my,"
Hermione exclaimed and grabbed Harry's arm. The fat lady had vanished from her portrait, which had been slashed so viciously that strips of canvas littered the floor. Great chunks of it had been torn away completely. Dumbledore took one look at the ruined painting and turned, his eyes somber, to see Professors McGonagall, Lupin, and Snape hurrying towards him. "We need to find her," said Dumbledore. "Professor McGonagall, please go to tell Mr. Filch at once, and tell him to search every painting in the castle for the fat lady." "You'll be lucky," said a cackling voice. It was Peeves the poltergeist, bobbing over the crowd and looking delighted, as he always did, at the sight of wreckage or worry. "What do you mean, Peeves?" said Dumbledore calmly, and Peeves's grin faded a little. He didn't dare taunt Dumbledore. Instead, he adopted an oily voice that was no better than his cackle. "Ashamed, your headship, sir. Doesn't want to be seen. She's a horrible mess. Saw her running through the landscape. Up on the 4th floor, sir. Dodging between the trees. Crying something dreadful," he said happily,
Poor thing, he added unconvincingly. Did she say who did it? Said Dumbledore quietly. Oh yes, Professor Head, said Peeves, with the air of one cradling a large bombshell in his arms. He got very angry when she wouldn't let him in, you see. Peeves flipped over and grinned at Dumbledore from behind his own legs. Nasty temper he's got. That Sirius Black.
Chapter 9. Grim Defeat. Professor Dumbledore sent all the Gryffindors back to the Great Hall, where they were joined 10 minutes later by the students from Hufflepuff, Ravenclaw, and Slytherin, who all looked completely confused. The teachers and I need to conduct a thorough search of the castle, Professor Dumbledore told them, as Professor McGonagall and Flitwick closed all doors into the hall. I'm afraid that, for your own safety, you will have to spend the night here. I want the prefects to stand guard over the entrances to the hall, and I am leaving the head boy and girl in charge. Any disturbance should be reported to me immediately, he added to Percy, who was looking immensely proud and important. Send word with one of the ghosts. Professor Dumbledore paused, about to leave the hall, and said, Oh, yes, you'll be needing. One casual wave of his wand, and the long tables flew to the edges of the hall, and stood themselves against the walls. Another wave, and the floor was covered with hundreds of squashy purple sleeping bags. Sleep well, said Professor Dumbledore, closing the door behind him. The hall immediately began to buzz excitedly. The Gryffindors were telling the rest of the school what had just happened. Everyone into their sleeping bags, shouted Percy. Come on now, no more talking. Lights out in 10 minutes. Come on, Ron said to Harry and Hermione. They seized 3 sleeping bags and dragged them into a corner.
Do you think Black's still in the castle?
Hermione whispered anxiously.
Dumbledore obviously thinks he might be,
said Ron.
It's very lucky he picked tonight, you know,
said Hermione, as they climbed fully dressed into their sleeping bags and propped themselves on their elbows to talk.
The one night we weren't in the tower?
I reckon he's lost track of time, being on the run,
said Ron.
Didn't realize it was Halloween. Otherwise he'd have come bursting in here.
Hermione shuddered. All around them, people were asking each other the same question. How did he get in?
Maybe he knows how to operate,
said a Ravenclaw a few feet away. Just appear out of thin air, you know? Disguise himself, probably, said a Hufflepuff 5th year. He could have flown in, suggested Dean Thomas.
Honestly, am I the only person who's ever bothered to read Hogwarts the history?
Said Hermione crossly, to Harry and Ron.
Probably,
said Ron.
Why?
Because the castle is protected by more than walls, you know,
said Hermione.
There are all sorts of enchantments on it, to stop people entering by stealth. You can't just apparate in here. And I'd like to see the disguise that could fool those Dementors. They're guarding every single entrance to the grounds. They've seen him fly in, too, and filtering all the secret passages. They'll have them covered.
The lights are going out now, Percy shouted. I want everyone in their sleeping bags and no more talking. The candles all went out at once. The only light now came from the silvery ghosts, who were drifting about, talking seriously to the prefects, and the enchanted ceiling, which, like the sky outside, was scattered with stars. What with that, and the whispering that still filled the hall, Harry felt as though he was sleeping outdoors, in a light wind. Once every hour, a teacher would reappear in the hall to check that everything was quiet. Around 3 in the morning, when many students had finally fallen asleep, Professor Dumbledore came in. Harry watched him looking around for Percy, who had been prowling between the sleeping bags, telling people off for talking. Percy was only a short way away from Harry, Ron, and Hermione, who quickly pretended to be asleep, as Dumbledore's footsteps drew nearer. Any sign of him, Professor? Asked Percy in a whisper. No. All well here. Everything's under control, sir. Good. There's no point moving them all now. I've found a temporary guardian for the Gryffindor portrait hole. You'll be able to move them back in tomorrow. And the fat lady, sir? Hiding in a map of Agershile, on the 2nd floor. Apparently she refused to let Black in without the password, so he attacked.
She's still very distressed, but once she's calmed down, I'll have Mr. Filch restore her. Harry heard the door of the hall creak open again, and more footsteps. Headmaster. It was Snape. Harry kept quite still, listening hard. The whole of the 3rd floor has been searched. He's not there. And Filch has done the dungeons. Nothing there either. What about the astronomy tower? Professor Trelawney's room? The owlry? All searched. Very well, Severus. I didn't really expect Black to linger. Have you any theory as to how he got in, Professor? Asked Snape. Harry raised his head very slightly off his arms to free his other ear. Many, Severus. Each of them as unlikely as the next. Harry opened his eyes a fraction and squinted up to where they stood. Dumbledore's back was to him, but he could see Percy's face, ramped with attention, and Snape's profile, which looked angry. You remember the conversation we had, Headmaster, just before, the start of term, said Snape, who was barely opening his lips, as though trying to block Percy out of the conversation. I do, Severus, said Dumbledore, and there was something like warning in his voice. It seems almost impossible that Black could have entered the school without inside help. I did express my concerns when you appointed... I do not believe a single person inside this castle would have helped Black enter it, said Dumbledore, and his tone made it so clear the subject was closed that Snape didn't reply. I must go down to the Dementors, said Dumbledore. I said I would inform them when our search was complete. Didn't they want to help, sir? Said Percy. Oh, yes, said Dumbledore coldly. But I'm afraid no Dementor will cross the threshold of this castle while I am headmaster. Percy looked slightly abashed. Dumbledore left the hall, walking quickly and quietly. Snape stood for a moment, watching the headmaster, with an expression of deep resentment on his face. Then he, too, left. Harry glanced sideways at Ron and Hermione. Both of them had their eyes open, too, reflecting the starry ceiling. What was that about? Mouthed Ron. The school talked of nothing but Sirius Black for the next few days. The theories about how he had entered the castle became wilder and wilder. Hannah Abbott, from Hufflepuff, spent much of their next herbology class telling anyone who'd listen that Black could turn into a flowering shrub. The fat lady's ripped canvas had been taken off the wall and replaced with the portrait of Sir Cadogan and his fat grey pony. Nobody was very happy about this. Sir Cadogan spent half his time challenging people to duels, and the rest thinking up ridiculously complicated passwords, which he changed at least twice a day. He's butterkin mad, said Seamus Finnegan angrily to Percy. Can't we get anyone else? None of the other pictures wanted the job, said Percy, frightened of what happened to the fat lady. Sir Cadogan was the only one brave enough to volunteer. Sir Cadogan, however, was the least of Harry's worries. He was now being closely watched. Teachers found excuses to walk along corridors with him, and Percy Weasley, acting, Harry suspected, on his mother's orders, was tailing him everywhere, like an extremely pompous guard dog. To cap it all, Professor McGonagall summoned Harry into her office. With such a somber expression on her face, Harry thought someone must have died. There's no point hiding it from you any longer, Potter, she said, in a very serious voice. I know this will come as a shock to you, but Sirius Black, I know he's after me, said Harry wearily. I heard Ron's dad telling his mum. Mr. Weasley works for the Ministry of Magic. Professor McGonagall seemed very taken aback. She stared at Harry for a moment or two, then said, I see. Well, in that case, Potter, you'll understand why I don't think it's a good idea for you to be practicing Quidditch in the evenings. Out on the pitch with only your team members, it's very exposed, Potter. We've got our first match on Saturday, said Harry, outraged. I've got to train, Professor. Professor McGonagall considered him intently. Harry knew she was deeply interested in the Gryffindor team's prospects. It had been she, after all, who'd suggested him as Seeker in the first place. He waited, holding his breath. Professor McGonagall stood up and stared out of the window at the Quidditch pitch, just visible through the rain. Well, goodness knows, I'd like to see us win the cup at last. But all the same, Potter, I'd be happier if a teacher were present. I'll ask Madame Hooch to oversee your training sessions.
The weather worsened steadily as the first Quidditch match drew near. Undaunted, the Gryffindor team were training harder than ever, under the eye of Madame Hooch. Then, at their final training session before Saturday's match, Oliver Wood gave his team some unwelcome news.
We're not playing Slytherin,
he told them, looking very angry.
Flint's just been to see me. We're playing Hufflepuff instead.
Why? Chorused the rest of the team.
Flint's excuse is that their Seeker's arm's still injured,
said Wood, grinding his teeth furiously.
But it's obvious why they're doing it. Don't want to play in this weather. Think it'll damage their chances.
There had been strong winds and heavy rain all day, and as Wood spoke, they heard a distant rumble of thunder. There's nothing wrong with Malfoy's arm, said Harry furiously. He's faking it.
I know that, but we can't prove it,
said Wood bitterly.
And we've been practicing all those moves assuming we're playing Slytherin. And instead it's Hufflepuff. And their style's quite different. They've got a new captain and Seeker, Cedric Diggory.
Angelina, Alicia, and Katie suddenly giggled.
What?
Said Wood, frowning at this light-hearted behavior. He's that tall, good-looking one, isn't he? Said Angelina. Strong and silent, said Katie, and they started to giggle again.
He's only silent because he's too thick to string two words together,
said Fred impatiently.
I don't know why you're worried, Oliver. Hufflepuff are a pushover. Last time we played them, Harry caught the cinch in about 5 minutes, remember? We were playing in completely different conditions,
Wood shouted, his eyes bulging slightly.
Diggory's put a very strong side together. He's an excellent seeker. I was afraid you'd take it like this. We mustn't relax. We must keep our focus. Slytherin are trying to wrong-foot us. We must win. Oliver, calm down, said Fred, looking slightly alarmed. We're taking Hufflepuff very seriously. Seriously.
The day before the match, the winds reached howling point, and the rain fell harder than ever. It was so dark inside the corridors and classrooms that extra torches and lanterns were lit. The Slytherin team were looking very smug indeed, and none more so than Malfoy. If only my arm was feeling a bit better, he sighed, as the gale outside pounded the windows. Harry had no room in his head to worry about anything except the match next day. Oliver Wood kept hurrying up to him, between classes and giving him tips. The third time this happened, Wood talked for so long that Harry suddenly realized he was 10 minutes late for Defense Against the Dark Arts, and set off at a run, with Wood shouting after him.
Diggory's got a very fast swerve, Harry, so you might want to try looping him.
Harry skidded to a halt outside the Defense Against the Dark Arts classroom, pulled the door open, and dashed inside. Sorry I'm late, Professor Lupin, But it wasn't Professor Lupin who looked up at him from the teacher's desk. It was Snape. This lesson began 10 minutes ago, Potter, so I think we'll make it 10 points from Gryffindor. Sit down. But Harry didn't move. Where's Professor Lupin? He said. He says he is feeling too ill to teach today, said Snape with a twisted smile. I believe I told you to sit down. But Harry stayed where he was. What's wrong with him? Snape's black eyes glittered. Nothing life-threatening, he said, looking as though he wished it was. 5 more points from Gryffindor, and if I have to ask you to sit down again, it will be 50. Harry walked slowly to his seat and sat down. Snape looked around at the class. As I was saying before Potter interrupted, Professor Lupin has not left any record of the topics you have covered so far. Please, sir, we've done Bogarts, Redcaps, Kappas, and Grindylows, said Hermione quickly. And we're just about to start... Be quiet, said Snape coldly. I did not ask for information. I was merely commenting on Professor Lupin's lack of organization. He's the best Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher we've ever had, said Dean Thomas boldly. And there was a murmur of agreement from the rest of the class. Snape looked more menacing than ever.
You are easily satisfied. Lupin is hardly overtaxing you. I would expect first years to be able to deal with redcaps and grindlers. Today we shall discuss. Harry watched him flick through the textbook to the very back chapter, which he must know they hadn't covered. Werewolves, said Snape.
But, sir,
said Hermione, seemingly unable to restrain herself.
we're not supposed to do werewolves yet. We're due to start Hinky Punks.
Miss Granger, said Snape, in a voice of deadly calm. I was under the impression that I was taking this lesson, not you. And I am telling you all to turn to page 394. He glanced around again. All of you, now. With many bitter sidelong looks and some sullen muttering, the class opened their books. Which of you can tell me how to distinguish between the werewolf and the true wolf? Said Snape. Everyone sat in motionless silence. Everyone except Hermione, whose hand, as it so often did, had shot straight into the air. Anyone? Snape said, ignoring Hermione. His twisted smile was back. Are you telling me that Professor Lupin hasn't even taught you the basic distinction between...
We told you, said Parvati suddenly. We haven't got as far as werewolves yet. We're still on...
Silence, snarled Snape. Well, well, well. I never thought I'd meet a third-year class who wouldn't even recognize a werewolf when they saw one. I shall make a point of informing Professor Dumbledore how very behind you all are.
Please, sir,
said Hermione, whose hand was still in the air.
The werewolf differs from the true wolf in several small ways. The snout of the werewolf...
That is the second time you have spoken out of turn, Miss Granger, said Snape coldly. 5 more points from Gryffindor for being an insufferable know-it-all.
Hermione went very red, put down her hand, and stared at the floor with her eyes full of tears. It was a mark of how much the class loathed Snape. They were all glaring at him, because every one of them had called Hermione a know-it-all at least once. And Ron, who told Hermione she was a know-it-all at least twice a week, said loudly,
You asked us a question, and she knows the answer. Why ask if you don't want to be told?
The class knew instantly he'd gone too far. Snape advanced on Ron slowly, and the room held its breath.
Detention, Weasley, said Snape silkily,
his face very close to Ron's.
And if I ever hear you criticize the way I teach a class again, you will be very sorry indeed.
No one made a sound throughout the rest of the lesson. They sat and made notes on werewolves from the textbook, while Snape prowled up and down the rows of desks, examining the work they had been doing with Professor Lupin.
Very poorly explained. That is incorrect. The kappa is more commonly found in Mongolia. Professor Lupin gave this 8 out of 10. I wouldn't have given it 3.
When the bell rang at last, Snape held them back.
You will each write an essay to be handed in to me on the ways you recognize and kill werewolves. I want 2 rolls of parchment on the subject, and I want them by Monday morning. It is time somebody took this class in hand. Weasley, stay behind. We need to arrange your detention.
Harry and Ron left the room with the rest of the class, who waited until they were all out of earshot, then burst into a furious tirade about Snape. Snape's never been like this with any of our other Defense Against the Dark Arts teachers. Even if he did want the job, Harry said to Hermione, why's he got it in for Lupin? Do you think this is all because of the Bogart?
I don't know,
said Hermione pensively.
But I really hope Professor Lupin gets better soon.
Ron caught up with them 5 minutes later, in a towering rage.
Do you know what that...
He called Snape something that made Hermione say,
Ron!
...is making me do? I've got to scrub out the bedpans in the hospital wing, without magic.
He
He was breathing deeply, his fists clenched. Why couldn't Black have hidden in Snape's office, hey? He could have finished him off for us. Harry woke extremely early next morning. So early that it was still dark. For a moment, he thought the roaring of the wind had woken him. Then he felt a cold breeze on the back of his neck, and sat bolt upright. Peeves the poltergeist had been floating next to him, blowing hard in his ear. "What did you do that for?" said Harry furiously. Peeves puffed out his chest, blew hard, and zoomed backwards out of the room, cackling. Harry fumbled for his alarm clock and looked at it. It was 4:30. Cursing Peeves, he rolled over and tried to get back to sleep. But it was very difficult now he was awake. To ignore the sounds of the thunder rumbling overhead, and pounding of the wind against the castle walls, and the distant creaking of the trees in the forbidden forest. In a few hours, he would be out on the Quidditch pitch, battling through the gale. Finally, he gave up any thought of more sleep, got up, dressed, picked up his Nimbus 2000, and walked quietly out of the dormitory. As Harry opened the door, something brushed past his leg. He bent down just in time to grab Crookshanks by the end of his bushy tail and drag him outside. "You know, I reckon Ron was right about you," Harry told Crookshanks suspiciously. "There are plenty of mice around this place. Go and chase them. Go on," he added, nudging Crookshanks down the spiral staircase with his foot. "Leave Scabbers alone." The noise of the storm was even louder in the common room. Harry knew better than to think the match would be cancelled. Quidditch matches weren't called off for trifles such as thunderstorms. Nevertheless, he was starting to feel very apprehensive. Wood had pointed out Cedric Diggory to him in the corridor. Diggory was a 5th year, and a lot bigger than Harry. Seekers were usually light and speedy, but Diggory's weight would be an advantage in this weather, because he was less likely to be blown off course. Harry whiled away the hours until dawn in front of the fire, getting up every now and then to stop Crookshanks sneaking up the boys' staircase again. At long last, Harry thought it must be time for breakfast, so he headed through the portal alone. "Stand and fight, you mangy curl!" yelled Sir Cadogan. "Oh, shut up," Harry yawned. He revived a bit over a large bowl of porridge, and by the time he started on toast, the rest of the team had turned up. "It's going to be a tough one,"
said Wood, who wasn't eating anything. "Oh, stop worrying, Oliver," said Alicia soothingly. "We don't mind a bit of rain." But it was considerably more than a bit of rain. Such was the popularity of Quidditch, the whole school turned out to watch the match as usual. But they ran down the lawns toward the Quidditch pitch, heads bowed against the ferocious wind, umbrellas being whipped out of their hands as they went. Just before he entered the changing room, Harry saw Malfoy, Crabbe, and Goyle laughing and pointing at him from under an enormous umbrella on their way to the stadium. The team changed into their scarlet robes and waited for Wood's usual pre-match pep talk, but it didn't come. He tried to speak several times, made an odd gulping noise, then shook his head hopelessly and beckoned them to follow him. The wind was so strong they staggered sideways as they walked out onto the Quidditch pitch. If the crowd was cheering, they couldn't hear it, over fresh rolls of thunder. Rain was splattering over Harry's glasses. How on earth was he going to see the snitch in this? The Hufflepuffs were approaching from the opposite side of the pitch, wearing canary-yellow robes. The captains walked up to each other and shook hands. Diggory smiled at Wood, but Wood now looked as though he had lockjaw and merely nodded. Harry saw Madame Hooch's mouth form the words, "Mount your brooms." He pulled his right foot out of the mud with a squelch and swung it over his Nimbus 2000. Madame Hooch put her whistle to her lips and gave it a blast that sounded shrill and distant. They were off. Harry rose fast, but his Nimbus was swerving slightly with the wind. He held it as steady as he could and turned, squinting into the rain. Within 5 minutes, Harry was soaked to his skin and frozen, hardly able to see his teammates, let alone the tiny snitch. He flew backwards and forwards across the pitch, past blurred red and yellow shapes, with no idea of what was happening in the rest of the game. He couldn't hear the commentary over the wind. The crowd was hidden beneath a sea of cloaks and battered umbrellas. Twice, Harry came very close to being unseated by a bludger. His vision was so clouded by the rain on his glasses, he hadn't seen them coming. He lost track of time. It was getting harder and harder to hold his broom straight. The sky was getting darker, as though night had decided to come early. Twice, Harry nearly hit another player, without knowing whether it was a teammate or an opponent. Everyone was now so wet, and the rain was so thick, he could hardly tell them apart. With the first flash of lightning came the sound of Madame Peach's whistle. Harry could just see the outline of wood, in the thick rain, gesturing him to the ground. The whole team splashed down into the mud. "I called for a timeout," Wood roared at his team. "More under here." They huddled at the edge of the pitch, under a large umbrella. Harry took off his glasses and wiped them hurriedly on his robe. "What's the score?"
"We're 50 points up,"
said Wood.
"But unless we get the snitch soon, we'll be playing into the night."
"Got no chance with these on," Harry said, exasperated, waving his glasses. At that very moment, Hermione appeared at his shoulder. She was holding her cloak over her head, and was inexplicably beaming. "I've had an idea, Harry. Give me your glasses, quick." He handed them to her, and as the team watched in amazement, Hermione tapped them with her wand and said, "Impervious." "There," she said, handing them back to Harry. "They'll repel water." Wood looked as though he could have kissed her.
"Brilliant,"
he called hoarsely after her, as she disappeared into the crowd.
"Okay, team, let's go for it."
Hermione's spell had done the trick. Harry was still numb with cold, still wetter than he'd ever been in his life, but he could see. Full of fresh determination, he urged his broom to the turbulent air, staring in every direction for the snitch, avoiding the bludgeon, ducking beneath Diggory, who was streaking in the opposite direction. There was another clap of thunder, followed immediately by forked lightning. This was getting more and more dangerous. Harry needed to get the snitch quickly. He turned, intending to head back towards the middle of the pitch, but at that moment, another flash of lightning illuminated the stands, and Harry saw something that distracted him completely. The silhouette of an enormous shaggy black dog, clearly imprinted against the sky, motionless in the topmost empty row of seats. Harry's numb hands slipped on the broom handle, and his nimbus dropped a few feet. Shaking the sodden fringe out of his eyes, he squinted back into the stands. The dog had vanished.
"Harry!
Came Wood's anguished yell from the Gryffindor goalposts.
Harry, behind you!"
Harry looked wildly around. Cedric Diggory was pelting up the pitch, and a tiny speck of gold was shimmering in the rain-filled air between them. With a jolt of panic, Harry threw himself flat to the broom handle and zoomed towards the snitch. "Come on!" he growled at his nimbus, as the rain whipped his face. "Faster!" The wind, though as strong as ever, was forgetting to roar. It was as though someone had turned off the sound, as though Harry had gone suddenly deaf. What was going on? And then, a horribly familiar wave of cold swept over him, inside him, just as he became aware of something moving on the pitch below. Before he'd had time to think, Harry had taken his eyes off the snitch and looked down. At least 100 Dementors, their hidden faces pointing up at him, were standing below. It was as though freezing water was rising in his chest, cutting at his insides. And then he heard it again. Someone was screaming inside his head. A woman. "Not Harry! Not Harry! Please, not Harry! Please!" "Stand aside, you silly girl! Stand aside now! Not Harry! Please, no! Take me! Kill me instead!" Numbing, swirling white mist was filling Harry's brain. What was he doing? Why was he flying? He needed to help her. She was going to die. She was going to be murdered. He was falling through the icy mist. "Not Harry, please, have mercy, have mercy." A shrill voice was laughing. The woman was screaming, and Harry knew no more.
"Lucky the ground was so soft. I thought he was dead for sure. But he didn't even break his glasses."
Harry could hear the voices whispering, but they made no sense whatsoever. He didn't have a clue where he was, or how he got there, or what he'd been doing before he got there. All he knew was that every inch of him was aching, as though it had been beaten. That was the scariest thing I've ever seen in my life. Scariest. The scariest thing. Hooded black figures. Cold. Screaming. Harry's eyes snapped open. He was laying in the hospital wing. The Gryffindor Quidditch team, splattered with mud from head to toe, was gathered around his bed. Ron and Hermione were also there, looking as though they'd just climbed out of a swimming pool.
Harry,
said Fred, who looked extremely white underneath the mud.
How are you feeling?
It was as though Harry's memory was on fast forward. The lightning, the Grim, the Snitch, the Dementors. What happened? He said, sitting up so suddenly they all gasped.
You fell off,
said Fred.
Must have been, 50 feet?
We thought you died, said Alicia, who was shaking. Hermione made a small, squeaky noise. Her eyes were extremely bloodshot. But the match, said Harry. What happened? Are we having a replay? No one said anything. The horrible truth sank into Harry like a stone. We didn't lose?
Diggory got the snitch,
said George.
Just after you fell. He didn't realize what had happened. When he looked back and saw you on the ground, he tried to call it off, wanted a rematch. But they won fair and square. Even Wood admits it.
Where is Wood? Said Harry, suddenly realizing he wasn't there.
Still in the showers,
said Fred.
We think he's trying to drown himself.
Harry put his face to his knees, his hands gripping his hair. Fred grabbed his shoulder and shook it roughly.
Come on, Harry, you've never missed a snitch before. There had to be one time you didn't get it, said George. It's not over yet, said Fred. We lost by 100 points, right? So if Hufflepuff lose to Ravenclaw, and we beat Ravenclaw and Slytherin, Hufflepuff will have to lose by at least 200 points, said George. But if they beat Ravenclaw, no way, Ravenclaw are too good. But if Slytherin lose against Hufflepuff, it all depends on the points. A margin of 100 either way.
Losing one's way.
Harry lay there,
Losing
not
one's
saying
way.
a word. They had lost. For the first time ever, he'd lost a Quidditch match. After 10 minutes or so, Madame Pomfrey came over to tell the team to leave him in peace.
We'll come and see you later, Fred told him. Don't beat yourself up, Harry. You're still the best seeker we've ever had.
The team trooped out, trailing mud behind them. Madame Pomfrey shut the door behind them, looking disapproving. Ron and Hermione moved nearer to Harry's bed. Dumbledore was really angry, Hermione said in a quaking voice. I've never seen him like that before. He ran onto the pitch as you fell, waved his wand, and you sort of slowed down before you hit the ground. Then he whirled his wand to the Dementors, shot silver stuff at them, then left the stadium straight away. He was furious they'd come into the grounds. We heard him.
Then he magicked you onto a stretcher,
said Ron,
and walked up to the school with you floating on it. Everyone thought you were...
His voice faded away, but Harry hardly noticed. He was thinking about what the Dementors had done to him, about the screaming voice. He looked up and saw Ron and Hermione looking at him so anxiously.
People will die.
He cast around for something matter-of-fact to say. Did someone get my nimbus? Ron and Hermione looked quickly at each other. What? Said Harry, looking from one to the other. Well, when you fell off, it got blown away, said Hermione hesitantly. And it hit...
Hello.
It hit... Oh, Harry.
What
it hit
can
the
I do for
Whomping
you?
Willow. Harry's insides lurched. The Whomping Willow was a very violent tree, which stood alone in the middle of the grounds. And... he said, dreading the answer.
Well, you know the Whomping Willow,
said Ron.
It doesn't like being hit.
Professor Flitwick brought it back just before you came around, said Hermione in a very small voice. Slowly, she reached down for a bag at her feet, turned it upside down, and tipped a dozen bits of splintered wood and twig onto the bed. The only remains of Harry's faithful, finely beaten broomstick. Chapter 10. The Marauder's Map. Madame Pomfrey insisted on keeping Harry in the hospital wing for the rest of the weekend.
He didn't argue or complain, but he wouldn't let her throw it away.
People will die.
His Nimbus 2000. He knew he was being stupid. He knew that the Nimbus was beyond repair, but Harry couldn't help it. He felt as though he'd lost one of his best friends. He had a stream of visitors, all intent on cheering him up. Hagrid sent him a bunch of earwiggy flowers that looked like yellow cabbage. And Ginny Weasley, blushing furiously, turned up with a get-well card she'd made herself, which sang shrilly unless Harry kept it shut under his bowl of fruit. The Gryffindor team visited again on Sunday morning, this time accompanied by Wood, who told Harry, in a hollow, dead sort of voice, that he didn't blame him in the slightest. Ron and Hermione only left Harry's bedside at night, but nothing anyone said or did could make Harry feel any better, because they only knew half of what was troubling him. He hadn't told anyone about the Grim, not even Ron and Hermione, because he knew Ron would panic and Hermione would scoff. The fact remained, however, that it had now appeared twice, and both appearances had been followed by near-fatal accidents. The first time, he had nearly been run over by the night bus. The second, fallen 50 feet from his broomstick. Was the Grim going to haunt him until he actually died? Was he going to spend the rest of his life looking over his shoulder for the beast? And then there were the Dementors. Harry felt sick and humiliated every time he thought of them. Everyone said the Dementors were horrible, but no one else collapsed every time they went near them. No one else heard echoes in their head of their dying parents. For Harry knew who that screaming voice belonged to now. He had heard her words, heard them over and over again, during the night hours in the hospital wing, while he lay awake, staring at the strips of moonlight on the ceiling. When the Dementors approached him, he heard the last moments of his mother's life, her attempts to protect him, Harry, from Lord Voldemort, and Voldemort's laughter before he murdered her. Harry dozed fitfully, sinking into dreams full of clammy, rotted hands and petrified pleading, jerking awake only to dwell again on the sound of his mother's voice. It was a relief to return on Monday, to the noise and bustle of the main school, where he was forced to think about other things, even if he had to endure Draco Malfoy's taunting. Malfoy was almost beside himself with glee at Gryffindor's defeat. He'd finally taken off his bandages and celebrated having the full use of both arms again, by doing spirited imitations of Harry falling off his broom. Malfoy spent much of their next potions class doing Dementor imitations across the dungeon. Ron finally cracked, flinging a large, slippery crocodile heart at Malfoy, which hit him in the face, and caused Snape to take 50 points from Gryffindor.
If Snape's taking defense against the dark arts again, I'm gonna be sick, said Ron, as they headed towards Lupin's classroom after lunch. Check who's in there, Hermione.
Hermione peered around the classroom door.
It's okay.
Professor Lupin was back at work. It certainly looked as though he had been ill. His old robes were hanging more loosely on him, and there were dark shadows beneath his eyes. Nevertheless, he smiled at the class as they took their seats, and they burst at once into an explosion of complaints about Snape's behavior while Lupin had been ill.
It's not fair. He was only filling in. Why should he set his homework?
He don't know anything about werewolves.
They were all of parchment.
Did you tell Professor Snape we haven't covered them yet? Lupin asked, frowning slightly. The babble broke out again.
Yes, but he said we were really behind. He wouldn't listen. 2 rolls of parchment.
Professor Lupin smiled at the look of indignation on every face.
Don't worry. I'll speak to Professor Snape. You don't have to do the essay.
Oh no,
said Hermione, looking very disappointed.
I've already finished it.
They had a very enjoyable lesson. Professor Lupin had brought along a glass box containing Hinky Punk, a little one-legged creature who seemed as though he was made of wisps of smoke, rather frail and harmless looking.
Lures travelers into bogs,
said Professor Lupin, as they took notes.
You notice the lantern dangling from their hand? Hops ahead. People follow the light. Then...
The Hinky Punk made a horrible squelching noise against the glass. When the bell rang, everyone gathered up their things and headed for the door, Harry amongst them. But, "Wait a moment, Harry," Lupin called. "I'd like a word." Harry doubled back and watched Professor Lupin covering the Hinky Punk's box with cloth. "I heard about the match," said Lupin, turning back to his desk and starting to pile books into his briefcase. "And I'm sorry about your broomstick. Is there any chance of fixing it?" "No," said Harry,